Section 1. The galaxy's greatest enigma. There is a figure who has been walking the stars for 10,000 years. He does not command a legion. He holds no title the Imperium would recognize as legitimate. He carries no seal of office, no imperial mandate that would allow any officer of the Adeptus Terra to categorize him as anything other than a threat. He does not rule territory, or command armies, or direct the flow of materiel across a war zone. He operates entirely outside every structure that the Imperium uses to understand and classify the beings within its borders. And yet, by almost every reasonable measure of actual impact on the galaxy's events, he matters more than most of those structures combined. He wears a hood pulled low over armor that has endured more battles than most entire chapters will fight across their full spans of existence. The armor itself is remarkable, ancient, marked by 10,000 years of continuous use, shaped by a tradition that predates the Horus Heresy and carries the aesthetic of a world that no longer exists in the material universe. Beneath the hood, a face that nobody outside a vanishingly small number of people has ever seen clearly. At his sides rest a bolt pistol and a plasma pistol, each one worn smooth by decades of near-constant handling. Both weapons are master-crafted. Both fire with a precision that witnesses describe as beyond what physical skill alone should be able to produce. And both are so thoroughly associated with their owner that their ballistic signatures have been collected and cataloged by Dark Angel's intelligence across 10 millennia of pursuit. And across his back, sealed in its scabbard, untouched in any battle across the entirety of recorded history, a sword. The sword has never been drawn, not once. Not in close-quarter situations where a blade would have been the rational tactical choice. Not in desperate moments where any additional weapon would have tipped the balance. Not across 10,000 years of running and fighting and evading, and occasionally choosing to let himself be captured for purposes only he understood. Never drawn, never unsheathed, never raised in anger or self-defense or anything else. It sits there, constant and unexplained, across every account that has ever been written about this figure. That sword, the question of what it is, why he has never used it, and where he has been trying to take it for 10 millennia, is the key to everything. It is what this entire story is actually about. His name, if it is a name, is CYPHER. The question of why CYPHER has spent 10,000 years working toward the Emperor of Mankind is perhaps the most layered, most carefully constructed, most endlessly rewarding mystery in all of Warhammer 40,000. Not a mystery that frustrates through arbitrary withholding. A mystery that rewards because every piece of information it provides points, with increasing specificity, toward an answer that carries enormous weight. Each layer you pull back reveals something more interesting beneath it. And the deeper you go, the more you begin to understand that this is not a story about one character's personal quest. It is a story about the fate of the entire human species, mediated through one figure in a white robe who has been doing the most important job in the galaxy for longer than any living being can remember. This is a setting with Daemon Primarchs tearing holes in reality, a setting where gods of chaos openly compete to devour the souls of every living thing, a setting where entire civilizations burn as routine background noise in a war that has been grinding on for so long that its beginning is mythology rather than history. And within all of that, within this vast, ceaseless, apocalyptic narrative, one solitary figure with 2 pistols and an undrawn sword generates more sustained intellectual engagement from the community that loves this universe than almost any other character in it. The reason is not superficial. The reason is that CYPHER is the character around whom the setting's most fundamental unresolved question orbits. What is going to happen to the Emperor of Mankind? And the answer to that question, which the last several years of narrative development have been building toward with accelerating momentum, runs through a sword, a mission, and 10,000 years of patience that borders on the incomprehensible. To understand it properly, we need to start at the very beginning, not the 41st millennium, not the Great Crusade, or even the Horus Heresy. We need to go back to a world called Caliban, which no longer exists in the material universe, but whose shadow extends across the entire setting in ways that are still unfolding 10 millennia after its destruction. But before Caliban, there are 3 foundational things about CYPHER that most introductions handle imprecisely, and getting them right is the foundation of everything else. The first is the nature of his designation. CYPHER is not a personal name. It is a title, the title of Lord CYPHER, an ancient office within a chivalric warrior order on Caliban. The Lord CYPHER was the keeper of traditions, the living embodiment of the order's codes and principles, a figure whose institutional role required the complete surrender of personal identity. Name, face, personal history, all of it subsumed beneath the hood, and the responsibility. The Lord CYPHER became not a person, but a principle wearing flesh, an institution made human. This single fact transforms how you read everything that follows, because a man defined by institutional responsibility rather than personal ambition has entirely different motivations and entirely different limits than almost any other kind of actor you can imagine. The second is that at least 3 distinct individuals have held this title across the documented period. The question of which one is currently walking the galaxy is one of the great deliberate mysteries of the lore, maintained across multiple novel series and decades of releases with impressive consistency. The ambiguity is intentional and meaningful. It says something profound about what the Lord CYPHER role actually is, about the precedence of mission over individual identity that the role has always demanded. The third is the structural contradiction at the heart of his story. A figure legally classified as a traitor, one of the fallen angels, the Dark Angels, who turned against their Primarch during the catastrophe that destroyed their homeworld, who has spent 10,000 years doing the demonstrable work of a loyal servant without recognition or reward. His actions, taken as a body of evidence and examined without the prejudice of his legal classification, do not read as treason. They read as the most sustained, most patient, most costly act of loyalty in the setting's history. Everything else builds from these 3 facts. If you are watching this right now, drop a comment below. Tell me where in the world you are and what time it is there. I genuinely read every single one, and I love knowing where these videos find people. If you are not subscribed yet, please do it now. It costs you nothing, and it helps more than you might realize. Section 2. Caliban, the world that built the Dark Angels. Caliban was not like other worlds, and saying that in a setting where almost every planet is classified dangerous still understates something important about the particular quality of wrongness that defined it. The forests that covered most of Caliban's surface were dense enough to swallow light, ancient enough that the trees had grown to heights, making them architectural features rather than vegetation, and seething with a quality of menace that went beyond the ecological. The creatures that moved through them, the great beasts, were not simply the apex predators of a difficult ecosystem. They were wrong in the way that warp-touch things are wrong. They possessed what contemporary witnesses described as a malicious intelligence. They didn't merely hunt human settlements. According to Luther himself, they seemed to actively hate the people living there. They healed from wounds at speeds that made conventional hunting suicidal. Killing a single great beast was the defining achievement of a knight's career on Caliban. Killing a Calibanite lion, the largest, most powerful, most lethally intelligent of all the beasts, distinguishable by the ring of razor-sharp spines around its neck, was something only 2 individuals in the planet's recorded history ever managed. Later scholarship, possible only with the hindsight of understanding what chaos actually is and how the Eye of Terror operates, provides a clear explanation. Caliban sat close enough to the Eye of Terror that the membrane between the material universe and the warp was thinner there than in most inhabited systems. Over long centuries of proximity, warp energy had worked itself into the planet's biology at a fundamental level. The great beasts were mutated by that energy into something worse than natural predators. They were, effectively, weapons the warp had grown from the world's own native life. And the Knights of Caliban were the only thing standing between those weapons and the human population they seemed designed to consume. Caliban's civilization survived through institutional dedication to fighting these things. Knightly orders had arisen across the planet over generations, each one shaped entirely by the practical demands of monster hunting in environments where individual heroism without structural support meant death. The fortress monasteries these orders built were not merely training facilities. They were everything places of safety, of learning, of the carefully maintained transmission of hard-won knowledge about which tactics worked against which beasts and which approaches got everyone killed. The orders competed sometimes, cooperated sometimes, occasionally fought over territory or philosophy, but collectively represented the thing that made civilized life on Caliban possible at all. The most successful, most enduring, most broadly influential of these orders was simply called the Order. And the Order was built into its defining shape by a man named Luther. Understanding Luther as he was, before his corruption, matters enormously here, because the tragedy of Caliban's fall depends on understanding that Luther was genuinely exceptional before things went wrong. He was not a mediocre man who broke under pressure. He was one of the most capable human beings on his planet by any measurable standard. He had the martial brilliance that made him dangerous in individual combat, and the rarer administrative intelligence that let him build institutions capable of outlasting his personal involvement. He understood that structures mattered as much as talent. He built the Order with succession designed in, with redundancy, ensuring the organization could survive the loss of any single person, including himself. Within the Order's carefully designed hierarchy, the position of Lord CYPHER held a function unlike any other. He was not the military commander that was the Grand Master. He was not the political leader or the chief administrator. He was the keeper of institutional memory, the living embodiment of what the Order stood for at its deepest level, the figure who guaranteed continuity not just of practice, but of meaning. And the process of becoming the Lord CYPHER demanded something that most institutions would never ask of any individual: the complete surrender of personal identity. When someone assumed the title, they gave up their name. Their face was concealed permanently beneath the hood the role required. Those who had known them before were formally forbidden from acknowledging the person they had been. The Lord CYPHER, from the moment of assumption, was no longer a person with personal history and personal goals. They were the principle, the tradition, the institutional continuity in living form. This was not symbolic. It was literal and enforced. And it was designed for exactly the situation that eventually arose: catastrophic disruption. The Lord CYPHER was the element of the institution that could not be broken, could not be deterred, could not be distracted from the core purpose by personal considerations. They were built to continue regardless. Whatever happened, the Lord CYPHER continued. The first Lord CYPHER documented by the lore was an elderly human man who served during the Great Beast's final campaign and the period of integration with the Imperium. He died naturally, in old age, having fulfilled his role. He was the last Lord CYPHER who was simply a mortal human with an ordinary relationship to time and mortality. After him, everything became considerably more complicated. The first time the Emperor's Great Crusade found Caliban, what it actually found was a planet that had already been transformed by the partnership between Luther and the Primarch, who had been growing up in its forests for a decade before any human encountered him. Lion L. Johnson's capsule had crashed in the deep wilderness, and what should have produced a dead infant instead produced a decade or more of a being growing up alone in the most hostile environment on the planet. He hunted the great beasts with no weapons but his own body. He learned Caliban's forests the way the forests taught their lessons, by surviving them repeatedly when anything else would have died the first time. When Luther and a group of knights finally found him, he was already more capable in individual combat than anyone they had ever encountered. He came back with them, learned to speak with remarkable speed, and within months had demonstrated that his combination of strategic instinct and physical capability was simply without parallel on the planet. Luther named him Lion L. Johnson. The name means the lion, the son of the forest in Calibanite dialect. Luther chose it in recognition of both the circumstances of the Primarch's discovery and his ferocity, which reminded Luther of the most deadly of all the great beasts. It was a name that carried genuine weight, given with genuine respect that was, at that point, entirely mutual. What followed over the next several years was extraordinary. Together, Luther and L. Johnson coordinated the orders, combined their forces, planned a systematic campaign rather than the traditional reactive hunt, and cleared Caliban's forests of the great beasts within a single decade. The scale of this achievement cannot be overstated in Calibanite terms. Every generation before theirs had accepted that the forests would always threaten, that the beasts would always press against the walls of the fortress monasteries, that survival was the best available outcome. L. Johnson and Luther turned that assumption into history. In recognition, L. Johnson was named Supreme Grand Master of the Order, and effectively of all Caliban. Luther didn't resent this, not yet, not really, not at that point. What he felt was the first small stirring of an awareness that someone had arrived who was simply better than him. Not just younger, not just gifted with advantages Luther hadn't had, actually better, more capable, more naturally suited to leading at the highest level. And Luther, who had defined himself throughout his life by being the best available person for the most important jobs, had to begin adjusting to a world in which that was no longer quite true. That adjustment was manageable as long as the relationship between them remained what it was in those early years, a genuine partnership in which both contributions mattered. And for a while, it did. Then the Emperor came, and the context of everything changed overnight. Section 3 corruption, collapse, and the beginning of the mission. The arrival of the Imperial fleet above Caliban transformed the meaning of everything that had come before. El Johnson was claimed by his inheritance. The Dark Angel's Legion the First, the oldest, the Emperor's personal creation, was given to him as birthright. Caliban became the Legion's homeworld. The Order's young warriors were assessed for Space Marine recruitment. Those too old for full augmentation underwent alternative enhancements to serve in other capacities. Luther was given the task of managing Caliban during the Great Crusade. He accompanied the Lion initially, served with real distinction, demonstrated the qualities that had always made him exceptional. But the structure of a Space Marine Legion was built around a biology he didn't fully share. The gene seed hierarchy, the augmentation progression, the institutional culture that had grown up around beings transformed beyond ordinary human limits, all of it had a built-in advancement axis that Luther, however enhanced, could never quite fully access. He was always, structurally, the brilliant lieutenant rather than the peer. The talented human working alongside the transhuman and working in the shadow of the Primarch. The Lion's emotional distance made this worse. El Johnson was not a warm man before his long healing sleep. He was described by his brother Primarchs as dour, given to dark moods, constitutionally incapable of the kind of open communication that might have kept Luther grounded. He kept secrets reflexively, not from malice, but from a personality shaped by a decade alone in dangerous forests where information was survival advantage. He never quite learned that a trusted partner was not the same as an enemy who might use knowledge against you. And so the gap between what Luther needed to hear, reassurance, acknowledgement, genuine inclusion as an equal, and what he received grew wider across the years of the Great Crusade, without either man fully recognizing what was happening. The Lion eventually sent Luther back to Caliban to manage the homeworld. The mission was described as an honor. Luther experienced it as exile. 50 years of administration and recruitment, of being the trusted man left behind while the glory happened somewhere else, of managing a planet increasingly disconnected from the Great Crusade's momentum, while the warp's proximity to Caliban continued to work on the world's biology and on the minds of those who lived there. The corruption of Luther was not a single dramatic choice. It was an accumulation decades of resentment, finding direction it should not have found. Ancient libraries from the destroyed Knights of Lupus, a corrupted knightly order El Johnson had eliminated for its connections to warp-tainted lore, contained knowledge Luther was not supposed to have access to, but gradually acquired. A conspiracy of Terran sorcerers infiltrated Caliban and worked at destabilizing it from within. The discovery that Caliban itself carried a warp taint in its bedrock, an ancient artifact called the Ouroboros, that had been shaping the planet's darkness for far longer than anyone knew. All of it working together on a man whose greatest strength, his willingness to do whatever was necessary, had become his greatest vulnerability when what was necessary was defined by something that wanted him broken. During this same period, Zahariel El-Zurius, the only other man in Calibanite history to have killed a Calibanite lion, found himself also back on Caliban after the Council of Nicaea banned the use of librarians. A powerful psyker whose personal history with the planet was deeply interwoven with its strangeness, whose relationship with the Watchers in the Dark went back to encounters in his youth that went far beyond what utility alone could explain. Zahariel found his path entangled with Luther's rebellion in ways the novel's present with real moral weight. He was not a man who chose betrayal with clear eyes. He was a man in a situation that had been carefully engineered to make honest choice nearly impossible. Zahariel El-Zurius would eventually become the Lord CYPHER. He would eventually carry the sword across the warp-scattered destruction of Caliban and emerge into a galaxy that no longer had a place for him, carrying a mission that the institution that created it no longer existed to authorize or support. The Horus heresy erupted across the galaxy, and the Lion spent years fighting his way back through the ruin storm, that warp storm the word-bearers had constructed to cut off the Ultima Segmentum from Terra. At the moment it was most needed. Years in which communication with Caliban was impossible, and Luther's isolation became total, and the corruption reached its endpoint. When L. Johnson finally broke through toward Terra, he made a detour. Fragmentary intelligence had reached him about conditions on his homeworld. He came prepared for difficulty. He came expecting to need to exercise some force. He was not prepared for his entire orbital defense network to open fire on his fleet, without warning or explanation. The bombardment that followed was the Dark Angels returning fire against their own planet's defenses. Ships lost on both sides, casualties mounting with no clear purpose other than mutual destruction. When L. Johnson descended to the surface personally to find Luther directly, what met him was a man changed in the deepest sense, the qualities that had made Luther exceptional still present, but directed now by something that had worked on him for decades in the darkness of isolation. The fight between them was of the kind the setting reserves for its most personal and most terrible confrontations. Luther had been elevated by the Chaos Gods to a strength matching a Primarch's, something that should have been impossible for a non-Astartes human, something that spoke to how deeply invested the ruinous powers had become in this specific confrontation. He delivered a mortal blow. L. Johnson fell, and then Luther stopped. In the instant of apparent victory, something broke through the corruption, not permanently, not completely, but enough. He saw what he had done. Not strategically, personally. He was standing over the body of the man he had raised and mentored and competed with and resented and never stopped genuinely caring about, and the full weight of that reality arrived in him all at once. He couldn't continue. He collapsed beside the lion's body, the fight gone out of him. The Chaos Gods, who had spent decades cultivating this exact outcome, found that their instrument had failed them at the decisive moment and responded by destroying the world. The warp storm that consumed Caliban was their punishment and their withdrawal simultaneously. The planet's bombardment-stressed crust gave way under the storm's psychic pressure. Caliban shattered. It was pulled into the warp. Only the asteroid containing the main fortress monastery survived, hardened by its ancient void shields, too dense to simply pull apart. The fallen Luther's faction, those who had fired on the fleet, were swept from the fragmenting surface and scattered across space and time simultaneously. Not just different parts of the galaxy, different parts of the galaxy's history. Some emerged immediately after the heresy. Others emerged centuries or millennia later, experiencing the transit as instantaneous while history accumulated around them. This temporal scattering is why the hunt for the fallen has never had a fixed endpoint. They are still emerging into the present. The lion was taken by the Watchers in the dark. They carried him into the depths of the rock and placed him in a healing sleep that would last 10,000 years. The Emperor knew. Nobody else did. Luther was found among the ruins, babbling the same words over and over. The lion had been taken by the Watchers, and one day he would return and forgive Luther for what he had done. He was imprisoned in the rock's deepest cells and held there for the next 10 millennia. The surviving loyal Dark Angels made the choice that would define their chapter's identity forever. They would not confess the existence of the fallen to the wider Imperium. They would pursue the fallen in absolute secrecy and maintain the fiction that their history was clean. The wound was turned inward, and the Dark Angels became, from that moment, a chapter defined by a guilt they could never speak. And the Lord CYPHER emerged from the warp, carrying a sword and a mission. The institution was gone. The world it had been built on was gone. None of that changed the mission. The Lord CYPHER was built to continue regardless. And so, he continued. Section 4. The three identities behind the hood. At least 3 distinct individuals have held the title of Lord CYPHER across the documented period, And the question of which one is currently walking the 41st Millennium Galaxy is one of the most carefully maintained puzzles in the lore. The first Lord CYPHER, the elderly human man of the foundational period, died naturally after the Imperium's discovery of Caliban. He was the uncomplicated bearer of the title. After him, the role moved into territory the original institution was never quite designed for. The second Lord CYPHER was elevated during the integration period, following Caliban's joining of the Imperium. He came to the title as a mortal human and underwent the Space Marine augmentation process while formally occupying the role. His personal identity was erased upon assumption of the title, as tradition demanded. Two competing theories about his prior personal identity have sustained themselves for years, and they are worth examining because the more convincing one has specific, documented, textual evidence behind it. The first theory, that he was the last surviving member of the Knights of Lupus, the corrupted order L. Johnson had destroyed, who infiltrated the order under a false name, fails on examination of motivation and behavior. The Knights of Lupus were associated with the warp-tainted lore that contributed directly to Luther's corruption. Their libraries were part of the problem. The Lord CYPHER of the Heresy period was documented as an ally of the Watchers in the Dark and an active opponent of the corrupted faction. The motivations are directly opposed. Additionally, the novel Angels of Caliban specifically portrays Zahariel recognizing this Lord CYPHER after removing his helm, which would be implausible if the man under the hood was a Knight of Lupus infiltrator, rather than someone Zahariel actually knew. The second theory is Zahariel Elzurius himself. The specific evidence is the code word Starfire. This was the activation code for Caliban's orbital defense weapons, the exact code transmitted when L. Johnson's fleet was fired upon. It was known to exactly 4 people: Luther, Astalon, Griffane, and Zahariel. Not a category of officers, not the Lord CYPHER as a role. Those 4 specific individuals by name. During CYPHER's most recent documented capture by the Dark Angels, under interrogation in their most secure facilities, CYPHER spoke the word Starfire. He spoke it deliberately, as a demonstration of knowledge, as a calling card that cut through every alternative theory. The interrogator Chaplain Asmodee's documented reaction confirms it landed with exactly the weight CYPHER intended. The word was known to the chapter's records as something spoken during the attack. Astalon had mentioned it during his own interrogations across the decades of his imprisonment. But Astalon was supposedly the last surviving person who knew it. The chapter had no record accounting for another person in that specific group knowing it. And here was CYPHER, speaking it as naturally as a man, saying his own name. The simplest explanation is the correct one. He knows it because he was there. Because he was one of the 4. Because the Lord CYPHER currently walking the galaxy is, or at some point was, Zahariel Elzurius. The Watchers in the Dark consistently reinforce this reading through their behavior around CYPHER. In the Rock, during his voluntary surrender to the Inner Circle, the Watchers moved through the fortress in ways that reflected awareness of and tolerance toward his presence. Unusual behavior that contributed to the Inner Circle taking his claims seriously. Zahariel had a documented relationship with the Watchers from his youth, going back to encounters in the forests that went far beyond anything explicable by utility alone. Their endorsement of CYPHER, expressed in their characteristic indirect way, is the closest available confirmation that the person wearing the hood carries a genuine historical connection to what the title has always meant. There is also the possibility that the title has passed through more than 3 bearers across 10,000 years. The Lord CYPHER tradition demands the surrender of individual identity to the role. The mission could theoretically be inherited, the sword and purpose passed from one bearer to the next with perfect continuity. If this has happened, the current CYPHER carries everything his predecessors preserved and passed on, and the mission continues regardless of which specific consciousness is executing it now. What matters most is what the Emperor's own response confirms. The message "not yet," delivered through a specific vision to a specific custodian at a specific moment, was not addressed to a generic intruder seeking opportunistic access to the throne room. It was addressed to someone the Emperor knew, someone whose mission the Emperor had been tracking, someone whose arrival at that exact location was expected rather than surprising. You don't send "not yet" to someone you don't know. You send it to someone who has been waiting and whose wait you have been aware of. Section 5:10, 1,000 years. The pattern that proves the mission. 10,000 years is a number that loses weight through repetition in the 41st millennium. But apply it to one individual, one unbroken mission, one purpose maintained without deviation across that full span, and the weight comes back with force. 10,000 years is longer than all of recorded human civilization on our own planet. It is longer than every named empire and dynasty and institution in human history combined. It is a time span that makes anything sustained across it extraordinary by definition. CYPHER has been maintaining his mission across that entire span. His record is fragmentary, systematically misinterpreted through the lens of people who began with a predetermined conclusion. The Dark Angel's intelligence files on CYPHER are vast, detailed, and wrong in their conclusions. Compiled by an organization that has been asking the wrong questions for 10,000 years. What did he do wrong, rather than what is he trying to accomplish? But even through that distorting lens, a pattern is visible to any observer willing to look at the body of evidence without preconception. He helps people. Specifically and consistently, he helps people against threats that align with what the Chaos Gods and their servants represent. He kills tyrants and breaks cults and prevents disasters. He does all of this without recognition, without credit, and consistently in ways that ensure any benefit accrues to someone other than himself. This is not a trader's portfolio. This is the Lord CYPHER, maintaining the ancient tradition of service to what the institution stood for, expressed at galactic scale. Because galactic scale is the only scale available after the destruction of Caliban. Among his confirmed actions in the Dark Angel's own records, the elimination of the overfiend Tyranids, a warlord who had enslaved entire star systems across the Drakeburn sector, and against whom the Imperium had deployed fleets, armies, and assassins for decades, all of whom failed. CYPHER penetrated the apparently impregnable fortress alone, killed the overfiend, and left. He planted a Dark Angel's homing beacon so that when the chapter arrived to investigate a fallen sighting, they found a dead tyrant and ballistic evidence pointing to his weapons. He did the work and gave the credit away. Billions of people freed from subjugation, the combined imperial military apparatus had been unable to accomplish. His confirmed kills across the centuries include planetary governors who had become problems rather than administrators, Chaos Space Marine warlords, Space Marine chapter masters who had turned sorceress covens, cult leaders, high-ranking inquisitors. Some of these targets were individuals the Imperium was actively trying to eliminate. Others were threats the Imperium hadn't identified yet. The one consistency: they died, and the circumstances suggest intelligence and operational precision far beyond what any single fugitive should possess. His mobility across the galaxy is itself unexplainable by conventional means. He has been confirmed in active engagements across all 5 segmentums. The distances, the transit times, the absence of any fleet infrastructure, none of it computes with normal warp travel. The Harlequin connection, with Silandri Veilwalker serving as his direct companion during the Terran Crusade, points toward webway access as the answer. The Harlequins move through the webway with a freedom unavailable to almost anyone else in the setting, and they have clearly identified CYPHER's mission as something worth supporting with that access. The Harlequins serve Segarak, the Laughing God, the only Eldari deity to survive the fall, by existing as a concept rather than as a focus of concentrated emotional energy. Segarach's opposition to chaos is real and deep. Silandri Veilwalker herself has operated across centuries in service of Segarach's agenda, guiding Belisarius' call to recover artifacts critical to the Imperium's survival, directing the survival of Craftworld fleets against impossible odds, positioning key figures at key moments. Her alignment with CYPHER is consistent with this pattern of long-horizon strategic investment. If his mission moves toward an outcome that genuinely opposes the Chaos Gods at the level of the warp itself, that outcome aligns with everything the Harlequins serve. Their support is not charity, it is strategic. And the fact that it has been maintained, evidently, for an enormous span of time, tells you something about how seriously they assess the potential value of what CYPHER is carrying. His survival across 10,000 years of constant pursuit is itself statistically remarkable. The Dark Angels have deployed their full capabilities against him. Deathwing Terminators with centuries of hunting experience, Ravenwing companies on the fastest platforms the chapter operates, Interrogator chaplains capable of breaking Space Marines through sustained psychological pressure alone, entire unforgiven companies that abandon their other commitments to pursue credible sightings. The Inner Circle's own analyses, compiled from decades of failed capture operations, have reached a deeply uncomfortable conclusion. Something is protecting CYPHER. Some force or presence maintains his survival because his continued existence serves a purpose. The galaxy has not finished with him for. That force is not unnamed. The Emperor told a custodian to say, "Not yet," rather than authorizing lethal force. The Emperor is the protective presence, and the Emperor's protection makes the reason for CYPHER's survival as clear as anything in this lore ever gets. Section 6. The Sword That Waits. Of everything in CYPHER's story, the sword is the most important physical detail, and it has been maintained with absolute consistency across every account, across every edition of the game. 10,000 years. Hundreds of documented engagements. Close-quarters situations where every additional weapon would have mattered. Desperate moments where a blade would have been the rational choice. And the sword has never moved. The canonical answer to what it is, the Lion Sword, personal weapon of Lion L. Johnson, Primarch of the Dark Angels. Not simply a well-made combat blade, a weapon built for a Primarch at the height of the Great Crusade, associated with the most legendary warrior of the first and greatest of the legions, carrying psychic significance, accumulated across 10,000 years as the central object in the galaxy's greatest ongoing mystery. The complication. The Lion Sword was broken. In the Horus Heresy novel, Ruinstorm, covering the period when L. Johnson, Gilliman, and Sanguinius were attempting to navigate through the warp storm toward Terra, a confrontation between the Lion and Gilliman over competing strategic priorities went badly wrong. Gilliman took the Lion Sword and broke it against his armored thigh in a moment of furious disagreement. The sword that the Lion had carried through the entire Great Crusade was shattered. If what CYPHER carries is the Lion Sword, then what he carries inside that scabbard is fragments, a broken blade, a weapon that cannot function as a weapon and has not been used as a weapon across centuries of fighting because it is not, currently, a weapon. It is a broken thing waiting to be made whole. Where do you repair a weapon built for a Primarch, using techniques from the dark age of technology, carrying psychic weight of that magnitude? There is one place in the Imperium, with the combination of ancient technology and psychic power the task would require. The Golden Throne is constructed from Dark Age technology the Adeptus Mechanicus can barely maintain and cannot reproduce. The Emperor's remaining psychic capability, even in its diminished state, dwarfs anything else in the current galaxy. If there is anywhere a broken Primarch's blade could be made whole, if reforging it is possible at all, it is in the presence of the Emperor, using the throne's apparatus, directed by whatever intention the Emperor chooses to bring to the task. CYPHER has been moving toward the Golden Throne since before most living beings in the galaxy were born, always heading, eventually, toward Terra. Why has the sword never been drawn? The containment theory holds that the sword is not simply broken, but dangerous in its broken state. A weapon of this psychic significance, damaged as it was by a Primarch in rage, during the Ruinstorm, during the most turbulent psychic period since the Age of Strife, may be volatile outside the specific context designed to receive it. The scabbard contains something that needs to remain contained until the proper handling conditions exist. The oath theory holds that CYPHER is bound by a specific commitment not to draw the sword until exact conditions are met. The Lord CYPHER's entire identity is built around keeping commitments absolutely. If an oath was made by him or by an earlier bearer of the title, the Lord CYPHER was built to keep it regardless of circumstances. The sword remains sheathed because the oath is still in effect. The timing theory holds that the sword has been preserved for one specific act, and using it for any other purpose would waste it before it reaches the moment it was carried 10,000 years to reach. Not destruction, but expenditure before the proper purpose. The sword is the completion of a story 10,000 years in the building. It has been carried this far for the specific moment when all other conditions are right. And then there is what Guilliman's recognition tells us. When CYPHER appeared before the resurrected Primarch of the Ultramarines during the Terran Crusade, Guilliman recognized the sword. He had broken it himself with his own hands 10,000 years before. He knew exactly what he was looking at. His recognition was significant enough to shape his subsequent decisions throughout the entire crusade. A man who broke something in a moment of anger and has had 10,000 years to reckon with that act, and who finds that broken thing apparently intact, carried by a figure seeking an audience with the Emperor. Whatever Guilliman feared in that moment, it was not simple violence. He made the deal because he assessed CYPHER's mission as compatible with Imperial survival. He may have broken the deal because the Emperor told him the timing wasn't right, and the staged arrest placed CYPHER inside the Imperial Palace, within walking distance of the Golden Throne, waiting for a timing that would come. Section 7. The Terran Crusade. The closest he ever came. Robert Guilliman's resurrection was the first major disruption of the setting's geopolitical architecture since the heresy itself. The Primarch of the Ultramarines, preserved in stasis for 10,000 years by Belisarius Cahl's ancient technology, was revived during the 13th Black Crusade through a convergence that required Silandri Veilwalker's specific involvement. The living Saint Celestine's presence, Cahl's technical resources, and precise alignment of conditions that clearly required advanced coordination across multiple parties over considerable time. Guilliman woke into a galaxy that had decayed catastrophically without him. His first documented response was profound grief. The Imperium he had helped build had become its own opposite, a theocracy of fear and stagnation, maintained by superstition rather than understanding, wasting the potential of its citizens at a scale that dwarfed the losses of the heresy. The things being done in the Emperor's name bore so little resemblance to the Emperor's actual intentions that the grief of witnessing it was nearly incapacitating. He collected himself by focusing on practical necessity, as Guilliman always does. He gathered forces, declared his intention to reach Terra, assembled the Terran Crusade, and began moving. The journey went catastrophically wrong almost immediately. His fleet was intercepted near the Maelstrom by Magnus the Red and the Thousand Suns. Magnus used a powerful, sorcerous ritual to fling the entire Crusade fleet into the Maelstrom's complex warp currents. The Red Corsairs and Kairos Fateweaver operating with Abaddon's backing, and from a Blackstone fortress, Abaddon had gifted to Huron Blackheart after the Gothic War assaulted the disoriented fleet and captured it. Kairos used sorcery to immobilize Guilliman with psychic chains formed from the Primarch's own guilt and frustration, crystallized representations of his worst thoughts about his own failures, used as literal bindings. The Crusade was imprisoned aboard the Blackstone fortress. There Guilliman might have remained indefinitely, except CYPHER opened the cell. He arrived with Silandri Veilwalker. Together they had moved through the Blackstone fortress with a precision the Red Corsairs' garrison had no countermeasure for. They reached the cells, killed the guard, and CYPHER offered the deal: free passage to Terra through the webway in exchange for being brought before the Emperor. Guilliman agreed. The escape was violent and sustained. The Imperials fought through demonic forces, the armies of Khorne and Siench, temporarily cooperating against fleeing prey to reach the webway portal. At the portal, the bloodthirster Skarbrand attacked Guilliman directly and was defeated only through the sacrifice of Black Templars Marshal Amalrich, who drove his black sword through the creature's chest, allowing Guilliman to finish it. CYPHER contributed throughout this entire sequence, functionally and effectively. Inside the webway, the Thousand Suns Magnus, having foreseen this exact escape route, attacked in coordinated ambush at every junction. The Imperials fought their way through. Veilwalker then revealed a secret the Aeldari had maintained for millennia, a webway exit on Luna, Terra's moon, hidden behind wards that Imperial psychers couldn't pierce. The Crusade emerged there rather than risk giving Magnus direct access to Terra. On Luna's dusty surface, with Battlefleet Solar scrambling and Custodes deploying from Terra, the Crusade faced Magnus personally. Guilliman and his Daemon brother fought in direct combat, Magnus's psychic powers overwhelming, until the massed arrival of the Silent Sisters, whose null aura suppressed the warp's influence, combined with Veilwalker sealing the portal. Magnus was driven back. The battle was won. The Crusade reached Terra. Guilliman entered the Sanctum Imperialis alone and spent a full day with the Emperor. What transpired in that room is not recorded. He emerged and ordered the Adeptus Custodes to arrest CYPHER. CYPHER snarled in anger. He drew his pistols briefly before accepting the situation and surrendering with his fallen companions. They were taken to the dark cells, the most heavily warded, most comprehensively secure prison in the Imperium, inside the Imperial Palace, on Terra, beneath the building that contains the Golden Throne. CYPHER was closer to his destination than at any point in 10,000 years. He was inside the building. He was in the same complex as the Emperor. He was imprisoned, but he had been placed by Guilliman, who could have arranged for him to be transported anywhere in the galaxy, in the location closest to the Golden Throne that a prison could possibly be. The escape happened when a Dark Angel's strike force, infiltrating the palace to claim CYPHER for their own chapter's interrogation, destroyed the cell generators to breach the prison block and accidentally freed him. Free within the Imperial Palace, CYPHER moved immediately, not toward any exit, but deeper into the complex. He navigated the Path of Martyrs, a forgotten passage whose existence he knew, raising its own questions about the depth of his preparation for this specific situation. He fought through pursuing Dark Angels. He fought through deployed assassins. He reached the Bridge of Ascension. A wounded custodian warden named Hecaron stood in his path. Hecaron was badly wounded from a prior engagement. Physically, he was not a match for a functional space marine in combat. But he was not standing there to fight. He was standing there to deliver a message. Guided the lore is explicit by a vision from the Emperor himself. Not yet. CYPHER stopped. He accepted the message. He left the Imperial Palace. Section 8. Not yet. 2 words that contain everything. The not yet is the most important 2 words in CYPHER's story, and arguably among the most important in the entire current narrative of the setting. Let us sit with what they actually mean. First, the Emperor sent a specific, targeted psychic vision to a specific custodian at a specific moment, with a message calibrated to a specific person. You do not send not yet to someone you don't know. You send it to someone who has been working toward a destination and who you have been aware of and who you understand has something to deliver. The communication is intimate and assumes shared history. The Emperor knows CYPHER. The Emperor knows what CYPHER is carrying. The Emperor has been tracking the approach of this figure for a very long time. Second, not yet is structurally a deferral. The word yet implies a future yes, waiting behind a temporary no. It implies conditions, timing, a sequence that hasn't completed but will. If the Emperor wanted to permanently prevent CYPHER from reaching the throne room, the resources available to accomplish that were and remain overwhelming. Custodians, Sisters of Silence, the Officio Assassinorum, the entire infrastructure of the most fortified location in the galaxy, all available, not deployed for lethal purposes. Instead, 2 words that say, the moment is not here yet, but it is coming. Third, the Emperor produced a specific, contextually appropriate psychic communication at the exact right moment, through a specific individual, calibrated precisely to the recipient. Whatever the Emperor is doing on the Golden Throne, whatever process has been ongoing for 10,000 years of psychic immersion in the warp, it includes the capability to monitor and respond to specific situations in specific locations. This is not the capability of a being passively decaying into death. This is the capability of a being doing something, even if what he is doing is invisible from outside. Fourth, the placement. Guilliman placed CYPHER in the dark cells, rather than arranging for his removal from Terra. The dark cells are inside the Imperial Palace, inside the same complex as the Golden Throne. Guilliman is not a naive man. He understood where he was putting CYPHER. A man of his strategic intelligence would have known that the closest available confinement to the Emperor is not the same as maximum separation from the Emperor. He chose that placement. Then the Dark Angels, pursuing their own agenda, freed CYPHER and allowed him to navigate to within arm's reach of the Bridge of Ascension. The number of things that had to go wrong in a specific sequence for CYPHER to end up standing there, stopped by nothing but 2 words, suggests something other than coincidence. The Emperor is patient. He has been patient for 10,000 years. He knows what not yet means. He is counting toward a yet of his own. Currently, CYPHER is being hunted by a combined force of Dark Angels, Adeptus Custodes, and Sisters of Silence, simultaneously an unprecedented escalation that reflects the institutional alarm, his penetration of the imperial palace triggered. He has led the pursuing Dark Angels to defeat at the massacre at Darkmoor. He is moving. He is always moving. He has always been moving. The not yet was a timeline, not a wall. And the timeline is advancing. Section 9. What does CYPHER want? The full examination. The deliberate ambiguity of CYPHER's motivations has been maintained across decades of lore development, and understanding what he actually intends to accomplish requires examining every serious theory with full honesty about what each one explains and where each one falls short. The absolution theory is the oldest and most cited. CYPHER seeks forgiveness from the Emperor to stand before the only authority he considers meaningful and have the record of 10,000 years of service in the shadows, either accepted or rejected as penance for whatever role he played in Caliban's destruction. This theory has genuine textual support. The canonical rumors about the sword describe CYPHER as seeking to reforge it and present it to the Emperor to obtain absolution and forgiveness. His behavioral pattern across 10,000 years matches someone building a case through demonstrated loyalty, accumulating evidence in action rather than words. His acceptance of not yet, turning around and leaving when the Emperor said the moment was wrong, reflects deference rather than defiance. Where the absolution theory is incomplete, forgiveness does not require a specific broken sword. It does not require the timing conditions the Emperor's message implies. It does not require the constellation of other events, the Lion's return, the Starchild's advancement, Luther's confrontation with L. Johnson, that the broader narrative is clearly assembling. Absolution explains part of what is happening. It does not explain all of it. The revival theory argues that CYPHER's goal is not to receive something from the Emperor, but to enable something. To participate in, trigger, or facilitate the transformation the Emperor has been building toward the emergence of the Starchild, the rebirth of the Emperor's consciousness as an entity freed from the dying body and capable of engaging the warp dimension directly. The Starchild theory is one of the oldest concepts in the setting, originating in the earliest editions. The core idea, the Emperor's consciousness, over 10,000 years of psychic immersion in the warp, has been growing into something that no longer requires a physical anchor. Something that can exist as a warp entity rather than requiring a physical body to project psychic presence. And the most recent major canonical source, The End and the Death, the final volume of the Siege of Terra series, confirmed that this concept is still active canonical territory. After rejecting the possibility of becoming a fifth chaos god at the moment of defeating Horus, the Emperor cast out a portion of his own soul described as containing his hope, loyalty, compassion, mercy, and love. That fragment has been drifting in the warp for 10,000 years. The book used the precise phrase child star to describe it. Deliberate, unambiguous signaling that the star-child concept is being integrated into current canon in a new form. The visions spreading across the astropathic relay network since the psychic awakening golden infants, figures rising from thrones, impossible miracles accumulating with increasing frequency across segmentum solar, are this process becoming visible at its edges. A transformation approaching completion. And Chaos servants including Cor Phaeron and the entity Tenebrous are actively trying to prevent the Star Child's awakening, which confirms it is real and that its consequences for the enemies of humanity would be significant. Under the revival theory, the sword is the catalyst. Reforging it at the Golden Throne requires the Emperor to direct his remaining power toward the act of renewal. If the Star Child is sufficiently developed, if the conditions are right, that direction of power initiates the final phase of the transformation. The Emperor's consciousness completes its evolution into what it has been becoming. The physical body's death releases rather than destroys. The Star Child is born. Under this reading, CYPHER is not a supplicant seeking a favor. He is the mechanism through which the Emperor's own plan completes itself. He carries the key. The Emperor is the lock. 10,000 years of preparation were required to ensure they would meet at precisely the right moment. The mercy-killing theory is the most dramatic reading and requires care. Under this theory, the sword is not for reforging, but for release a weapon of mercy to end the Emperor's physical existence, liberating a consciousness that has been in agony for 10,000 years and allowing the Star Child's birth from the death of what contains it. The argument draws on honest accounts of the Emperor's actual condition. He is not at peace. He is in ongoing, exhausting, terrible suffering, a consciousness unable to rest for 10,000 years, fighting continuously, holding a line that slowly moves against him. The visions the lion experienced during the Arcs of Omen narrative describe not a god in repose, but a man begging to be released from the prison of his continuing existence. Under this theory, the mercy killing is the most loyal act imaginable. It ends the suffering. It releases the soul. And if the Star Child theory is correct, the release is not an ending, but a beginning. The Emperor reborn as something more capable, more free, more able to actually be what humanity needs than anything the Golden Throne can produce. Not yet. Fits perfectly. The Emperor wants to be freed, but the moment must be right. The Star Child must be sufficiently gestated. The Imperium must be capable of surviving the transition. The conditions must align. Not yet, but they are aligning. The Lion's absolution theory has the most emotional resonance in the current narrative, particularly since L. Johnson's return. Under this reading, CYPHER's primary relationship is with the Lion, rather than the Emperor directly. The visit to the Golden Throne is in service of reforging the sword, and the reforged sword is meant to be returned to L. Johnson, the Lord CYPHER, coming back to the Primarch he was built to serve, with the broken thing made whole, as proof that the traditions survived. The Lord CYPHER was created specifically to maintain what the Lion built. He has done that for 10,000 years. The reforged sword would be the statement the Lord CYPHER was built to make. I kept it. I carried it. I brought it back. The most honest answer to what CYPHER wants is that these theories describe facets of the same complex truth rather than competing alternatives. The act of arriving at the Golden Throne at the right moment simultaneously constitutes absolution, enables the Emperor's transformation, constitutes mercy toward a suffering being, and prepares something to be restored to the Lion. The Lord CYPHER's mission is not simple, because the things it serves were never simple. It is the most complex and most important errand in the setting's current narrative, and it requires all of these things to be true at once. Section 10. The Emperor on the Golden Throne. To understand what CYPHER would be walking toward at the destination of his 10,000-year journey, you need to understand what the Emperor actually is in the 41st millennium. He is dying, not gradually, not ambiguously. The Emperor's physical form is a ruin, barely maintained by the Golden Throne's mechanisms and the constant psychic input of the 1,000 psychers sacrificed to him every single day. Immobile. Deteriorating at a rate the Adeptus Mechanicus can slow but not reverse. The Golden Throne itself was not designed for indefinite operation. Its components are failing, its systems are degrading, and the manufacturing processes that produced it exceed the Mechanicus's current ability to fully reproduce. 1,000 psychers every day, 365,000 per year, 3.5 billion over 10,000 years, all brought to Terra on the black ships, their life force consumed to sustain the Emperor's psychic output and keep the Astronomicon burning. By some records, the number required has actually increased over the millennia, as the throne degrades currently estimated at 4 times the original requirement. The scale of this ongoing cost is staggering, and it is failing anyway. When the throne fails completely, and it will fail, this is not speculation, but certainty. The Astronomicon goes dark. Warp travel without navigational guidance becomes prohibitively dangerous. The Imperium's vast dispersed territory, held together by logistics infrastructure dependent on reliable transit, begins to fragment. Isolated systems cut off from communication and reinforcement, facing the darkness alone. Within a generation, organized human civilization collapses into isolated pockets, and those pockets are consumed. That is what happens if the throne fails without anything changing first. The Star Child theory proposes a different sequence. The Emperor's consciousness, immersed in the warp for 10,000 years, has not been static. It has been developing into something that no longer requires a physical anchor. The fragment of his soul cast free at the end of the siege of Terra, described in The End and the Death, as carrying his hope, loyalty, compassion, mercy, grace, and love. Described as luminescent, like a child star, has been growing in the warp for 10,000 years. Growing the way entities grow there, fed by emotional resonance, developing presence and capability, becoming more itself with every passing year. The visible evidence of this process is accumulating, living saints returning from death with increasing frequency, golden shields manifesting against demonic assault with no physical mechanism. The Emperor's psychic presence in the warp apparently strengthening rather than weakening, which should be impossible given the throne's degradation, unless the source is not the throne but the transformation, the visions spreading across the astropathic relay networks. The active opposition from Chaos servants who have identified the awakening Star Child as a threat that must be stopped. All of it pointing toward a process advancing toward completion. When the transformation completes, the death of the physical body will not be a catastrophe. It will be a completion. The Astronomicon will be renewed, powered not by the daily sacrifice of 1,000 lives, but by something that requires no such cost. The barrier against chaos, which the dying body barely maintains, will be reinforced by an entity capable of direct opposition to the chaos gods in their own dimension. The psychers of humanity will have an active protector in the dimension where they are most vulnerable. This is the best case. This is what the golden visions are prophesying. This is what the not yet is counting toward. CYPHER's sword, if it is the catalyst that initiates the final phase, if reforging it at the throne is what enables the Emperor to complete the change he has been building toward, is not simply a relic to be restored. It is the instrument through which the fate of every human being in the galaxy is determined. One broken sword, 10,000 years of patience, one figure who never stopped moving toward the door. Section 11. The Lion returns. The board shifts. The return of Lionel Johnson during the Arcs of Omen campaign changes every equation around CYPHER's mission. The Lion had been sleeping in the rock's hidden geological core for 10,000 years, tended by the Watchers in the dark, his existence unknown to the chapter's own leadership across 100 generations of Supreme Grand Masters. Vashtor, the Archiphane's assault on the rock, coordinated to obtain the Tukulcha engine as a component of a larger weapon, was violent and deep enough to disrupt the hidden chamber and wake the Lion. He emerged disoriented, alone, into active combat. And the first thing he did, before encountering any Dark Angels, was help ordinary people, Imperial workers caught in the fighting, a frightened elderly woman, a starving child. Not as a Primarch demonstrating beneficence toward lesser beings, but as a person responding to other people. 10,000 years of healing had done something the Great Crusade never managed. It had made him genuinely warmer, more present, more capable of human connection. The combat that followed was everything you'd expect from the most capable close combat Primarch in the setting. When he engaged the Daemon Primarch Angron, the incarnate avatar of the Chaos God of Blood, the banishment was decisive and complete. He is, as a military capability, fully intact, but he is changed where it matters for CYPHER's story. He is now the Lion who can hear things the pre-heresy version of himself would have been unable to hear. Critically, during the Arcs of Omen campaign, the Lion issued pardons to the fallen, not blanket absolution for every individual who had ever borne the classification, not for those who had genuinely and fully embraced chaos, but an offer of return to those fallen who had been caught in the catastrophe, rather than choosing it with clear eyes. This is a revolutionary departure from the Dark Angels' 10,000-year policy of hunt, interrogate, execute. The Lion recognizes, publicly and formally, that the fallen question is more complicated than the classification of traitor can capture. For CYPHER, this changes the context of any eventual meeting between them completely. The Lord CYPHER, who has spent 10,000 years demonstrating loyalty without recognition, service without reward, faithfulness to the principles the Dark Angels were built on, without any acknowledgement that faithfulness deserves, is among the most complex cases the fallen question contains. The version of the Lion now walking the galaxy is capable of recognizing that complexity. The version who existed before Caliban's fall was not. Luther has escaped the rock. The demonic assault that woke the Lion also freed him. He is somewhere in the galaxy now, and the confrontation between him and El Johnson, deferred for 10,000 years by Luther's imprisonment, and the Lion's healing sleep is coming. When it happens, the full reckoning with what occurred on Caliban will begin. Whatever CYPHER preserved of what the Lion built, whatever the sword means, whatever 10,000 years of service in the shadows adds up to, all of it is relevant to that confrontation. The board has shifted. The pieces are in motion in ways they have not been since the heresy itself. The not yet is becoming something shorter and more urgent with every passing year. Section 12. The Dark Angels and the Wrong Question. The Dark Angels have spent 10,000 years pursuing CYPHER without understanding what they are pursuing. To understand why, you have to understand what the chapter's obsession with the fallen has done to their institutional psychology. The fall of Caliban imposed a trauma on the chapter that was never properly processed. Survival depended on concealment, on maintaining the fiction that the chapter's history was clean. That secrecy became self-reinforcing over generations. Each level of initiation revealed a little more of the truth. Each advancement required a deeper commitment to keeping the secret, until the chapter's entire identity was built around the management of a guilt they could never speak outside their own ranks. The fallen are the visible evidence of that guilt. Every fallen alive is proof that something happened on Caliban, that the pride the chapter publicly projects is built on genuine shame. The imperative to hunt the fallen is therefore not purely about justice or security. It is existential. While any of them remain free, the secret remains vulnerable. This institutional psychology has systematically prevented the chapter from asking the right questions about CYPHER. They have been asking what he did wrong, who he is that they should capture and interrogate, what secrets he holds that could expose their shame. They have not been asking what he has been doing for 10,000 years, whether that record constitutes evidence of loyalty, or whether the classification of traitor applies to a figure whose behavior across 10 millennia consistently served the things the chapter was built to value. The interrogator chaplains who have come closest to capturing him, who have actually interrogated him in secure facilities, have consistently come away disturbed in ways their framework cannot accommodate. The Starfire moment is the clearest expression of this. Knowledge CYPHER delivered deliberately, as demonstration, that placed him at the center of events in a way that challenged everything the chapter thought it knew. He was there. The chapter's records didn't account for him. He was there anyway. The Lion's return creates the possibility of a different framework, a chapter leadership capable of acknowledging complexity. A Primarch who has already changed the approach to the fallen in ways that represent 10,000 years of policy evolution accomplished in one campaign. The question the chapter has been asking, what did CYPHER do wrong, may finally be replaced by the question that actually matters. What has he been trying to accomplish all this time? Section 13. The Bigger Picture. Why one figure holds the galaxy's fate. The final question is the foundational one. Why does this matter? Why does one figure with 2 pistols and a broken sword constitute a potential pivot point for the fate of the entire human species? The answer begins with the structural wound at the center of the setting. Warhammer 40,000 is built around a catastrophic absence. The most important being in human history was removed from the field at the moment of apparent triumph, and the cost of that removal has been 10,000 years of the slow decay of everything he built. The Imperium has become its own opposite, a theocracy of fear and stagnation, maintained by momentum rather than meaning, worshipping a man as a god when that man explicitly rejected divinity, persecuting the very human potential that the future requires. All of this is what happens when the founding intelligence is removed from its project, and the project continues without guidance. The Imperium is a monument to the Emperor's absence. Everything wrong with it flows from that central frozen moment at the end of the Horus Heresy. What would change if the absence ended? If the Emperor's consciousness, freed from the dying body and transformed into what it has been becoming, could re-engage with the galaxy in the dimension where the real battle has always been fought. The Astronomicon would no longer require the daily sacrifice of 1,000 lives. A consciousness operating directly in the warp as a fully formed entity of the Emperor's magnitude could power it without the terrible cost that has sustained it for 10,000 years. The barrier against chaos in the warp, which the dying body barely maintains and which the Great Rift has already compromised, would be reinforced by an active presence capable of direct opposition to the chaos gods in their own domain. Not a passive ward, but an entity that can actually fight in the dimension where fighting is possible. The Psychers of humanity manage through a system that kills millions, sacrifices the most powerful to the throne, and breaks survivors through training designed to suppress their gifts, would have an active protector, something that could shield rather than consume. something that could guide the development of human psychic capability toward the future the species needs. The Imperium might begin to recover from the worst of its self-destructive tendencies. The Emperor's direct presence, even as impressions and visions rather than physical commands, would provide something that 10,000 years of theological interpretation has utterly failed to provide: actual guidance. This is what is at stake in CYPHER's mission. Not the survival of one chapter's reputation, not the absolution of one soldier. The potential transformation of the galaxy's strategic situation through the liberation of the most important consciousness in human history from a prison that has held it for 10 millennia. The Dark Angels who hunt CYPHER are asking questions about chapter secrets, while the questions that actually matter are about the future of every living human being in the galaxy. The custodies pursuing him are doing their institutional duty without the context to understand that the figure they are protecting the Emperor from is the mechanism through which the Emperor's own plan may complete itself. The Chaos Servants attempting to prevent the Star Child's emergence understand the stakes better than the Imperium's own defenders do. They are trying to stop it because they know what it would mean for the powers that have been winning the war for 10,000 years. Only the Emperor fully understands it, and the Emperor said not yet. But the not yet is a countdown, not a wall. The conditions are building. The lion is active and has changed the fallen dynamic. Luther is loose, and his confrontation with El Johnson is coming. The Star Child's emergence is advancing. The throne is failing in ways that narrow, rather than extend the window for the transformation. Section 14. The Patience of 10,000 Years. CYPHER is out there right now, being hunted by the most determined and most resource-rich pursuit force ever assembled against a single individual Dark Angels, Adeptus Custodes, and Sisters of Silence simultaneously. Moving with the unhurried certainty of someone who has always known where they are going and has never had serious doubt that they will eventually arrive. The sword is on his back. It has never been drawn. It is waiting for the moment it was carried 10,000 years to reach. The Emperor said, not yet. Consider what it means to accept those two words after 10,000 years of working toward the moment they deferred. Any ordinary person would have broken. Any ordinary soldier would have fought past the wounded custodian and taken whatever outcome followed. Any figure whose motivation was personal ambition, vengeance, despair, the simple human need for the long wait to finally be over, would not have turned around and left when two words from a dying being told them the moment was wrong. CYPHER turned around and left. Because the Lord CYPHER was not built for personal motivation. He was built for institutional purpose. The mission matters more than the man. The timing matters more than the desire for completion. 10,000 years of waiting had already demonstrated that he could bear the weight of the wait. 2 more years, or 5, or 10, or whatever the conditions require. These are nothing to someone who has already waited for 10,000. This is the quality that makes CYPHER genuinely extraordinary in a setting full of extraordinary beings. Not the combat capability, though it is remarkable. Not the intelligence, or the planning, or the 10 millennia of accumulated operational experience. The patience. The willingness to serve a purpose so much larger than himself that personal desires become irrelevant. The institutional identity that the Lord CYPHER role built into him so thoroughly that even 10,000 years of solitary exile and constant pursuit have not eroded it. He is what the Order made him to be, what the institution designed, across centuries of careful development, as the thing it most needed in its keeper of traditions. A being whose commitment to purpose was unbreakable because it was not attached to the person who carried it. The person is almost incidental. The mission is everything, and the mission is almost complete. The not yet is becoming something shorter and more urgent. The board that has been static for most of 10,000 years is moving. Primarchs returning to the field. Ancient prophecies completing themselves. Enemies that have operated with impunity for millennia, finding the ground shifting under them. The Imperium tearing itself toward a future that may be catastrophe or transformation, depending on what happens at a specific moment, in a specific room, in a specific building on Terra. The moment when the Lord CYPHER stands before the Golden Throne with a broken sword in his hands, and the Emperor's not yet finally becomes now. Whatever happens in that room will not be decided by armies, not by the accumulated weight of 10,000 years of military history, not by the billion soldiers of the Astra Militarum, or the few thousand space marines, or the ancient war machines of the Adeptus Mechanicus, or the unyielding guardians of the Adeptus Custodes. It will be decided by one man. One broken sword made whole, and the 10,000-year patience of someone who understood from the beginning that the most important things are worth waiting for, no matter how long the wait becomes. That is the story of CYPHER. It is not over. It is barely in its final chapter, but the final chapter is coming, and the setting is building toward it faster than it has built toward anything since the gates of the Imperial Palace closed on the Battle of Terra. Whatever theory you hold about what CYPHER intends to do when he finally stands before the Golden Throne, whether you lean toward absolution, the Star Child's liberation, mercy, the Lion's sword restored, or some combination of all of them, the thread that connects all of those possibilities is the same. A man who accepted a role that required him to become a principle rather than a person, who carried that principle through the most sustained and solitary vigil in the setting's history, who was told not yet and accepted that deferral with the equanimity of someone who has been waiting 10,000 years and understands that the difference between 10,000 years and 10,002 is something he can manage. The Lord CYPHER was built to preserve the most important things against any force, for as long as required, without recognition, without reward, without the comfort of being understood by anyone around him. He has done exactly that, every moment of every year. For 10,000 years, the galaxy that built the institution that built him is gone. The world that institution stood on no longer exists. The Primarch it ultimately served slept through most of the time. CYPHER has been walking. None of it changed the mission. None of it changed the direction. And somewhere in the dark between the stars, right now, the Lord CYPHER is still moving toward the destination that has always been waiting. Not yet, but soon. If you watch this whole way through genuinely, thank you. This is the kind of lore that rewards the full investment, and knowing you stayed for all of it makes the work feel worthwhile. Drop a comment below right now. Where in the world are you watching from, and what time is it there? I love knowing where these videos find people, and I read every single comment. If you have not subscribed yet, please do it now. It costs you nothing, and it helps enormously, and I have much more of this kind of deep lore content coming. There is more on the Dark Angels, on Guilliman, on the Star Child, on everything that is building in this current era of the narrative. Stay with me. The Emperor protects, and somewhere out there, CYPHER watches. Until the next one. Section 15. The Watchers in the Dark, the Silent Witnesses. No examination of CYPHER's story is complete without spending genuine time on the Watchers in the Dark, because they are the most consistent supporting evidence for everything CYPHER represents. And because their nature, what they are, where they came from, why they care, illuminates aspects of the Caliban story that the human characters involved can never fully articulate. The Watchers in the Dark are small, robed figures who have been associated with Caliban and with the Dark Angels since before the Imperium arrived on that world. They move with a silence that feels deliberate rather than natural. They tend to appear at significant moments without having been summoned or directed. They were present in the fortress monasteries of Caliban in the era of the Great Beasts. They were present when Lionel Johnson was discovered. They were present throughout the events leading up to the fall. And after the destruction of Caliban, they were present on the rock, tending Luther in his cell, watching over the lion's healing sleep, maintaining secrets that no living human had been trusted with. Their alignment during the fall itself was unambiguous. When Luther's faction moved toward open rebellion, when the corruption that had been working on Caliban for decades finally produced its endpoint, the Watchers did not side with Luther. They did not remain neutral. They sided with the Lord CYPHER. The keeper of the Order's traditions, the figure whose institutional role made him the embodiment of what the organization had always stood for at its deepest level. That was who the Watchers chose. This choice is not incidental background detail. The Watchers are old, genuinely, incomprehensibly old enough that their origin predates the human settlement of Caliban by an unknown period. Old enough that they understand things about the warp and about the nature of reality that the most senior librarians in the galaxy would struggle to articulate. Old enough that their judgment has been proven right, repeatedly, across spans of time that make the Horus Heresy look recent. When the Watchers choose a side, they choose it for reasons that go beyond the immediate calculation. They are not tactical entities making short-horizon assessments. They are something much older than that, and their choice to align with the Lord CYPHER rather than with Luther, and their continued alignment with CYPHER across 10,000 years, is the closest thing the lore provides to an objective endorsement of his mission. In The Rock, during CYPHER's voluntary surrender to the Inner Circle, a surrender designed to accomplish specific objectives he could not accomplish while remaining outside the chapter's custody, the Watcher's behavior was one of the factors that made the Inner Circle take his claims seriously at all. They moved through the fortress in ways that reflected awareness of and tolerance toward his presence. The Supreme Grand Master, who had spent his career in a chapter that defined itself, partly through the absolute certainty that all fallen were enemies, found himself unable to categorize the Watchers' response to this specific prisoner as normal. The Watchers were telling him something. He did not have the full context to understand what they were saying, but he understood enough to listen differently than he otherwise would have. What are the Watchers, actually? The lore is deliberately incomplete here, which is appropriate. Several theories have been advanced across the decades of the setting's development. They may be remnants of the same beings, sometimes called the Old Ones, who seeded life across the galaxy in the distant past, and whose ancient conflict with the Necrontyr set in motion much of the galaxy's current situation. They may be aspects of the warp itself made manifest, embodiments of some quality of the galaxy that needs to be present in physical form for reasons that exceed current understanding. They may be something else entirely, unique in the way that the setting's oldest mysteries are unique, defying clean categorization, because they exist at the level of the universe's underlying architecture rather than at the level of the civilizations that move through that architecture. What is clear from the evidence of their behavior is this: they care about the Lion's story in a way that transcends any easily articulable motivation. They healed L. Johnson when he should have died. They maintained his sleep for 10,000 years. They kept his secret even from the chapter he had founded. They tended Luther rather than destroying him, maintaining the possibility of the confrontation that the story always required. They aligned with CYPHER rather than with the forces of corruption on Caliban. They have been present at every significant moment in this entire arc across its full span. Whatever CYPHER's mission ultimately is, whatever the sword actually means, whatever happens in the room with the Golden Throne, the Watchers will be there. They have been present at every important moment of this story. They will be present at its completion. Section 16. The Fallen Question. 10,000 years of the wrong answer. The way the Dark Angels have handled the Fallen Question for 10,000 years tells you everything about what the chapter became after Caliban's destruction, and why the chapter's approach has been systematically preventing the resolution it claimed to be working toward. The Fallen were classified as traitors. The word has a specific legal and institutional meaning in the Imperium, and it was applied to everyone who stood against L. Johnson's fleet when he returned to Caliban. But the population it described was never as homogeneous as the classification implied. Among the fallen, some had genuinely, irrevocably embraced chaos. They had opened themselves to corruption with clear eyes, had served the ruinous powers as willing instruments, and had committed acts that placed them beyond any meaningful conception of return. These individuals are enemies. The Dark Angels' hunt for them is legitimate. Their capture and interrogation serves a genuine purpose. Others were warriors who had been on Caliban when Luther's influence dominated the world, who had been swept up in events that moved faster than anyone could track, who had fired on the Lion's fleet because the men commanding them had done so, and the alternative, in that specific moment, was to fight their own brothers on a world already descending into chaos. Many of these individuals, scattered across time and space by the warp storm, emerged into a galaxy where they were immediately classified as enemies of the Imperium and hunted accordingly. Some became genuinely corrupt in response to that situation. Others spent 10,000 years as misclassified loyalists, unable to return because returning meant execution. The chapter's policy made no distinction between these categories. The classification of fallen was absolute. The hunt was universal. The interrogation and execution were the endpoint for every case, regardless of the individual's actual history or choices since Caliban's destruction. This policy served one purpose above all others: maintaining the chapter's institutional secret. As long as every fallen was hunted, captured, and silenced, the testimony of any individual, fallen testimony that might include accounts of what actually happened on Caliban that contradicted the chapter's maintained narrative, could not reach the wider Imperium. The hunt was never purely about justice. It was about information control. The cost of this policy, across 10,000 years, has been enormous. The Dark Angels have dedicated enormous resources to an internal obsession that has repeatedly compromised their effectiveness against external threats. They have killed people who, in many cases, were not guilty of the crimes they were being hunted for. They have maintained a secret whose weight has bent their institutional psychology into shapes that limit their effectiveness and their honesty. And they have spent 10,000 years pursuing CYPHER, the Lord CYPHER, who has been demonstrably serving the values the chapter was built around, as if he were an enemy. The Lion's return and his decision to offer pardons to the fallen is the first crack in this framework since Caliban's destruction. It acknowledges, publicly and in the Primarch's own voice, that the fallen question is more complex than the classification of traitor captures. It creates the possibility of a new framework, one that can distinguish between those who actively chose corruption and those who were catastrophically misclassified. For CYPHER, this matters in a very specific way. The Lord CYPHER has been working toward the Emperor for 10,000 years, without acknowledgement or institutional support. The chapter that should theoretically recognize and value what he represents has instead been hunting him. The Lion's return and the Lion's changed perspective creates the first genuine possibility of a different relationship between the Dark Angels and the figure who has been maintaining their traditions more faithfully than they have. Whether that different relationship ever actually materializes depends on events still unfolding, but the possibility now exists in a way it has not existed for 10,000 years. Section 17. The Chaos Gods and what they fear. The Chaos Gods have a specific relationship with the CYPHER story, and it is illuminating in a way that most analyses of the character underemphasize. The Chaos Gods are afraid of the Star Child. This is not speculation, it is documented in the lore through the actions of their servants. Cor Pharon, the Black Cardinal of the Word-Bearers and one of Lorgar's most dedicated servants, has identified the Star Child's awakening as something to be prevented. The entity Tenebris has been specifically deployed against the Star Child's emergence. Chaos forces have been observed, interfering with the visions, spreading across the astropathic relay networks, attempting to suppress the golden imagery before it can reach its intended recipients. This active opposition confirms several things simultaneously. First, the Star Child is real. Entities of the Chaos God's power and perspective do not waste resources opposing fictions. If Tsiencha's oracle servants and Chaos's most senior political figures are moving against the Star Child's awakening, it is because they have assessed it as a genuine threat to their interests. Their assessment is more reliable than almost any other available source of information about whether the transformation is actually occurring. Second, the Star Child's emergence would be bad for Chaos specifically, not merely inconvenient or challenging in a way that sophisticated powers could absorb and adapt to. Bad. Threatening to the fundamental conditions that allow Chaos to operate as it does. An emperor transformed and freed from the Golden Throne, an entity of his power and values operating directly in the warp dimension, would change the basic strategic situation in ways that the Chaos Gods have been working to prevent for 10,000 years. The ongoing corruption of the Emperor's servants, the gradual degradation of the Golden Throne, the depletion of the Astronomican's resources, all of it has been moving toward the endpoint of the throne's failure and the Emperor's final death without transformation. The Star Child's emergence is the path that bypasses that endpoint. Third, the timing of Chaos opposition has been accelerating. The interventions against the visions are recent, corresponding to the period since the psychic awakening. The urgency with which Chaos servants have been moving suggests that they are racing against a timeline they can see advancing, that the Star Child is close enough to full emergence, that the window for preventing it is narrowing. The entity Tenebris is particularly interesting here. It has been specifically deployed against the Star Child and has demonstrated knowledge of the transformation specifics that suggests deep intelligence on the subject. What Tenebris actually is, whether it is a servant of one specific chaos god, a coalition of demonic interests, or something more unusual, is not fully clear from available sources. But its focus on preventing the Star Child's emergence and the resources committed to that prevention confirms the threat assessment from the Chaos side. What does this mean for CYPHER? It means his mission has enemies who understand its significance better than his nominal allies do. The Dark Angels hunt him for chapter internal reasons. The Custodes pursue him as an institutional breach response. Neither group has the full picture of what CYPHER's mission, if successful, would accomplish. The Chaos Gods, operating through their servants, do have that picture, and they are working to prevent the completion of the mission, precisely because they understand its stakes. CYPHER has been operating for 10,000 years in a situation where the entities most motivated to stop him are the ones who most clearly understand what he is trying to accomplish. And the entities nominally on the same side as what he is trying to accomplish are the ones hunting him hardest. The irony of this situation is not lost on anyone who examines it carefully. Section 318. The Era Indomitus and the Accelerating Narrative. The era that began with Guilliman's resurrection, the opening of the Great Rift, and the launch of the Indomitus Crusade represents the most significant change in the setting's narrative direction since the introduction of the Horus Heresy book series. Things that were fixed for decades are now moving. Conditions that seemed permanent are changing. The frozen moment of the Horus Heresy's aftermath is finally, for the first time in the setting's history, beginning to thaw. The Great Rift split the galaxy in two. The half far from Terra Imperium Nihilus was cut off from the Astronomican's light for an extended period, left to survive in darkness that the setting's characters describe with genuine horror. The catastrophic vulnerability demonstrated by this event has made the question of the throne's eventual failure not a distant theoretical concern, but an immediate strategic planning problem. The Imperium has experienced, in miniature and temporarily, exactly what will happen if the throne fails completely. The memory of that experience is fresh. Primarchs are returning. Guilliman is active and commanding the Indomitus Crusade. The Lion is active and has already changed the Dark Angels' fundamental approach to their 10,000-year obsession. There are credible suggestions in the lore that other Primarchs are closer to return than they have been since the heresy. The dormant potential the setting has carried for decades, all those sleeping heroes in their chambers, all those legends that were supposedly permanent history, is beginning to activate. The psychic landscape is transforming. The psychic awakening produced a galaxy-wide increase in psychic activity, new psychers manifesting with unusual power and frequency, old abilities developing new expressions. This transformation is ongoing, accelerating, and points toward a future in which humanity's psychic potential is a more central factor in the species' survival than the Imperium's current management of that potential would suggest is desirable. The enemies of the Imperium are also advancing. The Tyranids continue their great devouring advance from the eastern fringe. Chaos forces poured through the Great Rift with a sustained momentum that the Indomitus Crusade has been managing but not halting. The Necrons awaken in increasing numbers as their long sleep concludes. The pressures are multiplying faster than the Imperium's ability to respond to them. The setting's current narrative is not moving toward a stable new equilibrium. It is moving toward a resolution, some fundamental change in the conditions that define the setting, after which nothing will be quite what it was before. The questions that have been open since the Horus Heresy. What happens to the Emperor? What becomes of the Golden Throne? Can the Imperium survive in its current form, or must it transform? All of them are approaching the moment of answer. CYPHER is the character whose mission, if successful, determines the shape of that answer. The fact that Games Workshop has been accelerating the narrative, specifically in the directions that make CYPHER's mission more rather than less plausible, returning the Lion, advancing the Starchild visions, having the not yet moment happen in a published narrative, rather than keeping it in ambiguous background lore, is itself significant. The creative direction of the setting is building toward something, and CYPHER is at the center of what it is building toward. Section 918. The making of a legend. Why CYPHER endures as a character. It is worth stepping back, briefly, from the lore itself to consider why CYPHER specifically has sustained the level of engagement he has generated across the decades of the setting's development. What is it about this character that produces ongoing discussion, theory, analysis, and genuine intellectual investment in a way that most characters, even famous, powerful, plot-significant characters, do not? The answer has several components. First, the mystery is structured correctly. The lore surrounding CYPHER does not withhold information arbitrarily or tease without delivering. It provides genuine information at every level of inquiry. The closer you look, the more you find while maintaining core mysteries that cannot be resolved by simply looking harder. The Starfire detail rewards research. The Watcher's alignment rewards attention to detail. The Not Yet rewards reading carefully. But the fundamental question, what happens when CYPHER reaches the Golden Throne, cannot be answered by current lore, because it has not happened yet. The mystery is unsolvable in the right way, through resolution rather than through revelation, through events rather than through exposition. Second, the character carries genuine emotional weight. The Lord CYPHER's situation, a being who surrendered personal identity to become a principal, who has been carrying a broken thing toward a distant destination for 10,000 years, who was told, "Not yet," by the only authority he considers meaningful, and turned around and kept going anyway, is genuinely moving. It is not complicated emotional weight in the sense of requiring deep reading to access. It is immediately comprehensible to anyone who has ever kept going at something difficult without recognition, without reward, without certainty that the effort would eventually amount to anything. Third, the character reflects something real about the setting's core themes. Warhammer 40,000 is, among other things, a meditation on the relationship between institutions and individuals, on the ways that institutional loyalty can become both sustaining and crushing, on what it means to serve something larger than yourself without that service destroying everything that makes you who you are. The Lord CYPHER embodies these themes at an extreme that clarifies rather than distorts them. He is what happens when institutional purpose is carried to its absolute logical endpoint, and the question of whether that endpoint represents genuine nobility or genuine tragedy is one the character refuses to answer for you. Fourth, the stakes are real. Not real in the sense of affecting actual people, but real in the sense of genuinely mattering within the internal logic of the setting. CYPHER's mission, if successful, changes the conditions of the setting fundamentally. If it fails, if the throne fails without the transformation, if the Star Child's emergence is prevented, if the sword never reaches the Golden Throne at the right moment, the consequences are not abstract. They are the end of everything the setting's protagonists have been defending for 10,000 years. Characters don't become genuinely interesting without genuine stakes, and CYPHER's stakes are as high as the setting has. Fifth, the payoff is visible on the horizon in a way it has not been before. For decades, CYPHER was a perpetual mystery, compelling but suspended, interesting but static. The current era of the narrative has created genuine momentum. The Not Yet happened. The Lion returned. The Star Child visions are spreading. The conditions are clearly assembling. Fans who have been invested in this character and this question for years or decades can see the resolution approaching, and that visibility adds urgency to the engagement. Whatever happens next in the narrative, whenever the Not Yet becomes now, the resolution of CYPHER's story will be one of the most significant events in the setting's history. For the people who love Warhammer 40,000, that resolution has been a long time coming. But then, so is everything worth waiting for. Section 20. Everything converging. What the endgame looks like. We should spend some time examining what the endgame of this story might actually look like when the conditions finally align, when the Not Yet becomes something else. The key variables are the ones that were not in place during CYPHER's first attempt to reach the throne room. The Lion's return and the changed approach to the fallen question clears one piece. The confrontation between L. Johnson and Luther, which has been coming for 10,000 years and is now possible in ways it was not when Luther was imprisoned, will constitute the full reckoning with Caliban. When that confrontation happens, the accounting of what the fall actually was, what choices were actually made, who was actually responsible, and who was a victim of circumstances and manipulation, will be completed in a way that the chapter's maintained narrative has never allowed. CYPHER's role in that accounting as a witness to what actually happened, as the figure who preserved what was worth preserving, as the Lord CYPHER bringing the traditions through the catastrophe, becomes relevant in a way it cannot be before the accounting begins. The Star Child's emergence needs to advance further. The visions that have been spreading since the psychic awakening are a leading indicator of a process rather than the process itself. When the emergence is sufficiently advanced, when the Star Child has enough presence in the warp that the Emperor's physical death will not simply be an ending the window for the final act opens. The not yet may have been partly about this. The Emperor, whose perception of the warp through 10,000 years of immersion gives him a vantage point unavailable to anyone else, may have been seeing that the Star Child was not ready, that bringing it forward prematurely would achieve less than allowing the full development that the timing requires. The throne's degradation creates an outer boundary. There is a timeline on which the throne fails without any intervention, and that timeline is shortening. The not yet implies a yet that comes before the window closes. If the conditions are not met before the throne fails on its own, the transformation cannot happen cleanly. It can only happen in crisis, with the disruption and cost that crisis-driven transformations always carry. Luther's resolution is the final piece that the current narrative is building toward most explicitly. The confrontation between him and L. Johnson, deferred by 10,000 years, cannot be deferred much longer. Luther escaped during the Arcs of Omen events. He is somewhere in the galaxy with purposes that Azrael can only speculate about. The lion knows Luther must be found and faced. When that confrontation happens, the emotional center of the Caliban tragedy, the friendship that broke, the betrayal that was also grief, the two men who were once the best things on their world destroying each other and their world in the process, reaches its resolution. And whatever resolution it reaches, CYPHER's 10,000-year mission is part of the answer to the question that confrontation poses. What does the actual moment look like? The lore cannot tell us, because it has not been written yet, but the structure of the story suggests several things. The sword will be reforged. However that happens, whatever the mechanism, the act of making the broken thing whole is the central action the story has been building toward. It requires the Emperor's involvement in some form. It requires CYPHER to be in the right place, with the right object, at the right moment. It probably requires the conditions described above to have been met. The Emperor's transformation will occur. The physical body on the Golden Throne will die has arguably been dying for 10,000 years, and the difference between the dying and the completed dying is a matter of the exact moment of the threshold. The Star Child will be born from that death. The Emperor's consciousness, freed from the prison of the failing body, will become what it has been becoming for 10,000 years. The Astronomicon will falter briefly. This is probably unavoidable, a transition cost built into the mechanism of the transformation, and then be renewed in a form that no longer requires the daily sacrifice of 1,000 lives. The warp will be disrupted because an entity of the Emperor's power completing its transformation into a direct warp presence will be the most significant psychic event since the birth of Slanesh. The Chaos Gods will respond with everything they have. And then the galaxy will be different in ways that are, from our current vantage point, impossible to fully map. The setting's defining condition, the Emperor's imprisonment, his absence from direct engagement, the stagnation that absence imposes, will have ended. What comes after that is a story that hasn't been written yet, and writing it is one of the most significant creative challenges the setting's development team has ever faced. CYPHER's role in that story, whatever comes after the moment in the throne room, is also unwritten. A figure who has spent 10,000 years as the Lord CYPHER, maintaining a mission in the shadows, may find that the mission's completion creates questions about what comes next, that the mission itself could not prepare him for. The Lord CYPHER was built to maintain traditions. If the purpose those traditions were maintained to serve has been accomplished, what does the holder of the title do afterward? That is a question for a story still to come. For now, the story is still in its penultimate chapter. The conditions are still converging. The not yet is still counting down. Section 21. The Legacy. Why this story matters to Warhammer 40K. In a setting built on darkness, on the relentless grinding of a civilization too large to steer, and too afraid of change to improve the story of CYPHER, represents something that the setting does not often allow itself. The possibility that patience and faithfulness to a purpose, maintained long enough and honestly enough, might actually accomplish something. This is not optimism in the simple sense. The setting is built to resist simple optimism, and the CYPHER story does not offer it. The cost of 10,000 years of waiting is real. The things lost during that time are real. The suffering of the Emperor on the Golden Throne, the daily death of 1,000 psychers, the countless lives consumed by the wars that might have ended sooner if the transformation had happened sooner. All of it is real, and none of it is erased by whatever eventually happens in the throne room. But the story offers something rarer than optimism. It offers the possibility that meaning survives catastrophe, that what was worth preserving can be preserved, however broken the circumstances, however long the carrying, that the most patient loyalty is not naivety, but something that, given enough time and enough determination, can accomplish what no amount of force can achieve. The Lord CYPHER was built by an institution that no longer exists, on a world that no longer exists, to preserve traditions for a Primarch who slept through most of the time the preservation was happening, in service of a mission whose original authorizing context was destroyed before the mission could be completed, and he kept going. Not because he was compelled to, not because the alternative was death or worse, because the Lord CYPHER was the principle, and the principle survived the destruction of everything else. In a setting where heroes die constantly, where institutions corrupt, where even the most powerful beings in the galaxy can be broken by the weight of what they carry, a figure who cannot be broken, because he has already become the thing he serves rather than a person carrying that thing, is genuinely extraordinary. It is extraordinary in a way that resonates precisely because it is extreme. Most of us cannot live up to that. But the story of someone who did, across 10,000 years of circumstances designed to make it impossible, says something about what the attempt looks like at its absolute furthest extension. That is why CYPHER endures, not because he is the most powerful character in the setting, or the most dramatic, or the most tragic, because he is the most faithful. And in Warhammer 40,000, a setting built on the consequences of faithfulness failing, on the catastrophe of the Horus Heresy's betrayals, a story about faithfulness succeeding, even at extraordinary cost, even after extraordinary delay, carries a weight that no other kind of story quite matches. The Emperor protects. Somewhere in the dark between the stars, CYPHER watches. The final chapter is coming. If you are still watching, thank you, from the bottom of my heart. This is one of the most complex and most rewarding pieces of lore in the entire setting, and doing it justice takes time and depth. I hope this gave you a new angle on a character you may have already known, or introduced you to one of the greatest mysteries in Warhammer 40,000 if you are newer to the lore. Drop a comment right now. Tell me where in the world you are watching from and what time it is. Tell me what you think CYPHER's actual intention is when he reaches the Golden Throne. Tell me whether you think the lion sword theory holds up, or whether you think the sword is something else entirely. I read every single comment, and I genuinely love the conversations these videos generate. Subscribe if you haven't, hit the bell. There is much more coming on the Dark Angels, on the Lion's ongoing story, on the Star Child, and what the Emperor's transformation might actually look like, on Guilliman and his complicated position at the center of everything. This is a rich, deep, endlessly rewarding universe, and I intend to keep exploring it with you. Until the next one. The Emperor protects. Section 22. The Horus Heresy Connection. CYPHER before the fall. Most discussions of CYPHER focus almost entirely on what he has been doing in the 10,000 years since the fall of Caliban, treating the events on Caliban itself as backstory rather than active part of the story. But there is a period between the beginning of the Horus Heresy and the fall of Caliban that deserves its own examination. Because what CYPHER did during those years, when the galaxy was already collapsing and his own world had not yet been destroyed, tells us something important about who he was and who he chose to become. During the opening stages of the Horus Heresy, before Luther's rebellion had fully crystallized on Caliban, the Lord CYPHER was active in ways that aligned unambiguously with the loyalist cause. He participated in a prison break and extraction of Garviel Loken, one of Horus's own sons of Horus, who had refused to follow his Primarch into betrayal a member of the Knights Errant operating under Malkador, the Sigillites' direction, one of the secret loyalist operatives who were essential to the Imperium's survival through the heresy. Working alongside the veteran warrior Iacton Cruz, CYPHER exfiltrated Loken from captivity on Caliban. He did this at a point when Caliban's allegiance was already complicated, when Luther's rebellion was developing, when the safer choice, the personally advantageous choice, was to keep his head down and navigate the local situation rather than commit to the broader war. He did not keep his head down. He helped the loyalists. He got Loken out. And when Cruz offered to bring him on as one of Malkador's agents, to formally incorporate him into the loyalist intelligence network operating in the shadows of the heresy, CYPHER declined. He would serve in the shadows, loyal but unremembered, not as an official agent of the Sigillite with acknowledged status and institutional support. As himself, the Lord CYPHER, serving the purpose of the institution whose traditions he embodied, without recognition. This detail is enormously revealing. He was offered legitimacy, offered the chance to be the recognized loyalist agent rather than the ambiguous figure operating in unclear territory, and he turned it down. Not because he rejected the loyalist cause. His action in getting Loken out had just demonstrated exactly which side he was on. But because the Lord CYPHER doesn't operate through institutional recognition, the role demands service that transcends and outlasts any single institutional alignment. Serving specifically as Malkador's agent would have meant accepting the Imperium's authority structure as the definitive frame for his actions. The Lord CYPHER's authority comes from something older than that, from the traditions of the Order, from the principles that the institution was built to preserve, from a commitment that predates the Imperium's involvement in Caliban and will. If CYPHER is right about where he is going, outlast any institutional structure the Imperium can produce. The choice to remain outside official institutional recognition while acting in alignment with loyalist goals is not inconsistency or evasiveness. It is the Lord CYPHER doing exactly what the Lord CYPHER is supposed to do, maintaining the principle rather than becoming identified with any specific power structure. Power structures fail, principles survive. The Lord CYPHER was built to be the thing that survives. This early heresy period also establishes something about the timing of the Lord CYPHER's assumption of the title. If the figure who extracted Loken was already the Lord CYPHER, already operating in the hood and without personal identity, then the title passed to Zahariel, or whoever current CYPHER is, at some point before this event. The transition happened during the early period of Luther's growing rebellion, during the years when Caliban was already becoming a place where loyalties were increasingly complicated, and the Lord CYPHER's role, maintaining the institution's principles against pressure, was already actively needed. There is a poignant quality to imagining Zahariel El-Zurius, a man who had already made choices he may have regretted, who had been involved in things on Caliban that had moved him toward positions he would not have chosen with full information, assuming the Lord CYPHER title as a kind of recommitment, a choice to become the principal rather than the compromised individual, a way of serving that transcended the specific moral accounting of his own history. Whatever he had done as Zahariel, the Lord CYPHER did not carry that baggage. The Lord CYPHER was the clean slate, the institution's embodiment, the traditions that survived regardless of the failures of any individual. This reading of the title assumption, as an act of deliberate recommitment to something larger than personal history, adds emotional depth to the question of what CYPHER is seeking at the Golden Throne. If the assumption of the title was itself a kind of absolution, a decision to become something purer than his own complicated history, then the mission to reach the Emperor may be the completion of that decision. The full arc from Zahariel's compromised choices on Caliban to the Lord CYPHER carrying the broken sword of the Lion Sword across 10,000 years to the door of the Golden Throne. That arc is the story of a man who chose over and over again to be the principle rather than the person. And the question of whether the principle can be acknowledged by the Emperor is the question the arc has always been building toward. Section 23. The technical mysteries. How does he do it? Beyond the philosophical and narrative dimensions of CYPHER's story, there are practical mysteries about how he operates that deserve attention. Because the operational aspects of his 10,000-year campaign are themselves significant, they imply resources, capabilities, and support structures that he should not, by any conventional analysis, possess. Start with longevity. CYPHER has been active in the galaxy since the Horus Heresy. Space Marines are long-lived by human standards. Absent catastrophic injury or catastrophic exposure to warp energy, a Space Marine might expect to live for centuries, possibly longer if the gene seed is particularly stable and the chapter's medical resources are excellent. But 10,000 years is not centuries. 10,000 years exceeds even the most optimistic estimates of natural Space Marine longevity by an enormous margin. There are a handful of mechanisms in the setting that could account for it. Stasis fields can suspend a being indefinitely if CYPHER has spent significant portions of the 10,000 years in stasis, emerging only for specific operations. The biological age problem largely resolves. The webway has unusual temporal properties in some of its passages, and extensive webway travel with Harlequin companions might involve traversing sections where time flows differently. Some rare beings in the setting have genuine extended natural lifespans through mechanisms that are poorly understood, the perpetuals being the most notable example, but not the only one. The Harlequin connection suggests the webway answer, as most likely. Silandri, Veilwalker, and her predecessors have clearly had an ongoing relationship with CYPHER across a very long period. The webway is their domain. They know every passage, including those with unusual temporal properties. If the Harlequins have been facilitating CYPHER's transit across the galaxy for much or most of the 10,000 years, they would have had both the capability and the motivation to route him through passages that minimized his biological age, while still allowing the accomplishment of the mission's requirements across the full span of time. Then there is the question of intelligence. How does CYPHER know what he knows? His operational intelligence across 10,000 years has been extraordinary. He knew about the overfiend Tyranids and how to reach him when the combined intelligence apparatus of the Imperium did not. He knew about the cults and governors and chapter masters who were problems before they became obvious enough for anyone else to address. He knew about Guilliman's captivity on the Blackstone Fortress, in the maelstrom intelligence that should have been inaccessible to a lone fugitive in the opposite segmentum. He knew about the path of martyrs inside the Imperial Palace, a forgotten passage whose existence few living beings could document. The Harlequin answer covers some of this. Segurach's servants operate across the full span of the galaxy with a freedom unavailable to almost anyone else, and they accumulate intelligence naturally as a consequence of that freedom. If the Harlequins have been sharing intelligence with CYPHER as part of their long-running strategic investment in his mission, the quality of his operational information becomes explicable. The intelligence about the Imperial Palace, the Path of Martyrs, specifically implies a different source. Not Harlequin-gathered intelligence about galactic events, but specific architectural knowledge of a building that has been the most heavily secured and least accessible structure in the Imperium for 10,000 years. The most likely explanation is old knowledge information gathered before the palace became what it is, preserved in the Order's traditions or in CYPHER's own memory, from a period when access to such information was possible. But the precision of his navigation suggests something more than old maps. It suggests either very recent intelligence or knowledge that goes beyond what old records alone could provide. There is also the question of his weapons. His bolt pistol and plasma pistol are described consistently as archaeotech technology from the Dark Age of Technology or early Great Crusade era, built to standards that the Imperium can no longer match. The fact that these weapons have remained operational across 10,000 years of continuous use, without the kind of institutional maintenance infrastructure that even the finest weapons require over such spans, implies either extraordinary engineering quality, extraordinary maintenance capability, or extraordinary repair access. The Harlequins have access to the Black Library, the repository of knowledge about chaos that the Eldari have been building since before humanity reached the stars. The Black Library's resources extend considerably beyond information about chaos, encompassing technological knowledge from the galaxy's deep history that no other institution possesses. If CYPHER's weapons have been maintained over 10,000 years, partly through access to Black Library resources, the technical mystery resolves. The price of that access would be significant. Nobody gets into the Black Library without the Harlequins deciding they should, but it would also be consistent with the Harlequins' long-term investment in supporting his mission. None of these technical mysteries have been fully resolved in the lore, and they probably never will be. The deliberate maintenance of CYPHER's mystery, the refusal to explain every mechanism, to account for every practical detail, is itself part of what makes the character compelling. Some mysteries are meant to be inhabited rather than solved. The Lord CYPHER's operational impossibility is part of his character, in the same way that his undrawn sword is. The question of how he does it matters less than the fact that he has done it for 10,000 years and continues to do it. Section 24 Voices from the Lore. What others say about CYPHER. One of the most interesting ways to understand a character in a setting like this is to look at how other characters react to and describe them, because those reactions reveal as much about the character as any direct description. CYPHER has been described by a remarkable range of observers across the decades of the lore's development, and the consistent thread through those descriptions, even from observers who consider him an enemy, is a quality of reluctant acknowledgement. The interrogator chaplains of the Dark Angels, whose institutional purpose is to hunt the fallen, and whose personal psychological formation makes them among the most unforgiving individuals in the setting, have repeatedly been documented as experiencing something other than simple hatred when dealing with CYPHER. Asmodai, the most dedicated and most brutal of the interrogator chaplains, a figure whose reputation for extracting confessions from fallen is unmatched in the chapter, had a reaction to CYPHER during the interrogation where Starfire was spoken, that the text characterizes as unprecedented. Not the familiar loathing, not the professional satisfaction of a hunter who has finally cornered his quarry. Something alien, a sense that he was looking at something the chapter's categories did not quite account for. Something that generated not rage, but a foreboding he could not name. That foreboding is appropriate. Asmodai is a man whose entire professional existence has been built around the certainty that the fallen are what the chapter says they are. CYPHER represents the most serious challenge to that certainty the chapter possesses. Not because CYPHER argues against it, he says very little, but because his existence demonstrates it without argument. A being who has been doing what he has been doing, for as long as he has been doing it, does not fit cleanly into the category of traitor. The category was not built for someone like this. Reboot Gilliman's documented reactions to CYPHER are significant for different reasons. Gilliman is not a man who makes deals casually. He assessed CYPHER quickly, under pressure, with incomplete information, and decided that making the deal was correct. This is a Primarch who has governed, planned, and led at the highest possible level across 10,000 years of experience. His snap judgments are better than most beings' considered conclusions. He looked at CYPHER, at the sword on his back, at the situation, and decided that whatever CYPHER intended was compatible with Imperial interests. Then he broke the deal. But he placed CYPHER inside the Imperial Palace rather than arranging for his removal from Terra. That placement speaks. It says, "I don't trust you enough to honor the deal, but I trust you enough to put you in the building, rather than taking you somewhere you can't do what you've been trying to do for 10,000 years. The Harlequins never explain their investment in CYPHER's mission. The Harlequins never explain anything, but the level of sustained support they have apparently provided webway access, intelligence, combat support. The presence of Silandri Veilwalker at multiple critical junctures across the full span of the current narrative constitutes one of the strongest implicit endorsements in the setting. These beings serve a deity whose survival depends on opposing chaos at the deepest possible level. They are not generous with their resources. The fact that they have been generous with CYPHER consistently and over a span that dwarfs most human civilizations is its own statement about what they think of his mission's value. Luther, in his rare moments of clarity during 10,000 years of imprisonment, spoke the words that have haunted the chapter across every Supreme Grand Master's tenure. The lion will return and absolve the fallen. He raved, he wept, he oscillated between madness and grief. But those words, repeated over and over, were the thread of something that was not delusion. The lion has returned. The absolution is beginning. And CYPHER, who was there, who was present, who knows what actually happened, is the figure through whom the full accounting will eventually be completed. There is a prophecy recorded in the Dark Angel's own archives, preserved despite the chapter's general policy of suppressing things that challenge the maintained narrative, that reads as follows. He weaves in and out of my vision. I see one who is many. I see they who will test the unforgiven. In one hand he carries hope, in the other, despair. I speak of CYPHER. He is coming closer all the time. Hope and despair simultaneously. One who is many, coming closer all the time. The prophecy does not resolve the question of what CYPHER is or what he intends. It holds the tension open, which is exactly appropriate. CYPHER represents both hope and despair, because what he carries could resolve into either, depending on the conditions when it is finally delivered. The not yet is the thing standing between hope and despair. When the yet arrives, one of them will be the answer. Section 25. The sword as symbol. What the undrawn blade means. The sword that CYPHER carries, undrawn across 10,000 years, has accumulated symbolic significance that goes beyond whatever physical object it actually is. In a setting where weapons are treated with near-religious reverence, where the bolter in a space marine's hands is understood to be a sacred instrument as much as a practical tool, the sustained non-use of weapon is itself a statement. A weapon that is never used is not a weapon anymore. It is something else, a carrier of significance, a promise not yet fulfilled, an obligation in physical form. The sword on CYPHER's back has been all of these things for longer than most institutions in the setting have existed. Consider what the sword has survived. 10,000 years of combat, CYPHER has fought across that entire span, and fighting in the setting typically means close quarters engagement, where a blade would be useful. The sword was never drawn. 10,000 years of pursuit, the hunters who have come closest to catching him, who have examined evidence of his activities and tried to deduce his vulnerabilities, have consistently noted that the sword is the one thing he protects above everything else, including his own life. He would sacrifice the pistols before he would sacrifice the sword. The sword is inviolable. Whatever oath or commitment governs the sword's use, it is the commitment that defines CYPHER more completely than anything else about him, more than the pistols and their legendary accuracy, more than the hood and the anonymity, more than the 10,000 years of patient service. The sword is the visible expression of the limit he will not cross, the thing he is saving for the specific moment it was always meant for. In narrative terms, objects carried for great distances and great lengths of time build up a weight that purely practical objects cannot carry. The sword is not just the lion sword, it is everything the 10,000 years of carrying it represent. It is the weight of every battle where drawing it was possible and choosing not to draw it was the harder choice. It is the discipline of a being who has never let urgency override purpose. It is 10,000 years of not yet, built into physical form. When it is finally drawn, or when it is placed before the Emperor in whatever state it is in at that moment, it will carry all of that weight. The act of presenting it, whatever act that ultimately is, will not be a simple physical transaction. It will be the completion of 10,000 years of patience and faithfulness and loss and determination made physical. The Emperor, who has been waiting for it and watching it approach for however long the Emperor has been aware of CYPHER's mission, will understand that weight. The broken sword made whole is not just the repair of a weapon, it is the completion of a story. The Calibanite lion was the creature for which the Primarch was named. The Calibanite lion was the most dangerous beast on a world full of dangerous beasts, the symbol of everything that was wild and powerful and untamable about Caliban's hostile environment. The lion's sword, named after a beast that has not existed for 10,000 years, carried toward a destination by the figure who embodies the traditions of the order that cleared those beasts from a world that no longer exists. There is something almost too perfectly circular about this. The sword of the lion, carried by the Lord CYPHER, moving toward the Emperor whose legions once transformed a medieval knightly world into a recruiting ground for the galaxy's greatest warriors. Everything connects. Everything has been connecting across 10,000 years toward a single moment in a single room where a single question is finally answered. Not yet, but the connections are tightening. The moment is coming. If you have made it all the way to the end of this journey through one of the most fascinating stories in all of Warhammer 40,000, I genuinely cannot thank you enough. This is the kind of deep lore that I love exploring, and sharing it with people who are equally invested in understanding every thread of these stories is why I make these videos. Drop a comment below and tell me where in the world you are right now, and what the time is. Tell me what your theory is. Mercy killing, absolution, Starchild catalyst, the lion's sword restored? I love seeing where people land on this, and I love the conversations that follow. Every comment gets read, every discussion matters. If you are not subscribed yet, please do it now. This channel is dedicated to exactly this kind of comprehensive, careful lore exploration, and there is much more coming. The Dark Angels are in the middle of the most significant chapter of their story since the heresy. Guilliman is reshaping the Imperium in real time. The narrative is moving faster than it has in decades, and I intend to be here covering every piece of it in depth. The Emperor protects until the next one. Section 26. The Rock and the Secrets Within. To understand CYPHER's relationship with the Dark Angels chapter fully, you need to understand the Rock, because the Rock is not simply the chapter's mobile fortress monastery. It is a monument to everything the chapter cannot acknowledge about itself, and the secrets buried within it are the secrets that CYPHER, more than anyone else alive, has the ability to resolve. The Rock is what remains of Caliban. Specifically, it is the chunk of Caliban's geological core that contained the fortress monastery called Alderach, the main base of the Order, later the main base of the Dark Angels' operations on the planet. When Caliban shattered under the warp storm, the void shields, protecting Alderach and its immediate surroundings, were dense enough to survive the destruction. The fortress became a massive asteroid, and the Dark Angels transformed that asteroid over the subsequent centuries into a mobile star fortress fitted with warp drives, void shields, and the full infrastructure of a chapter's headquarters. It is their home. It carries their battle standards, their relics, their gene seed vaults, their chapter archive, across 10,000 years of history. It contains the chambers of the Deathwing and the Ravenwing and the inner circle, where the chapter's deepest secrets are maintained. It is the most heavily defended and most thoroughly secured structure the Dark Angels control. And in its deepest chambers, for 10,000 years, it contained two secrets that no Supreme Grand Master could fully account for. The first secret was Luther. Imprisoned in a cell that nobody was fully certain he could not escape from, maintained by stasis fields and tended by watchers in the dark, oscillating between madness and grief and very occasional clarity, producing prophecy that was never acknowledged as prophecy, because acknowledging it would mean acknowledging that the lion was coming back, and that Caliban's full story had not yet been told. Luther was the chapter's most embarrassing prisoner, the second in command of the Legion who had fired on the Primarch, whose existence confirmed that the fall was even worse than the maintained narrative suggested, whose testimony, if heard by the wider Imperium, would undermine the chapter's reputation completely. The second secret was Lion L. Johnson himself, sleeping in the geological core, healed and waiting, known only to the Emperor and the Watchers in the Dark, and not to any of the chapter's living officers. CYPHER knew about both. Or rather, and this is the important distinction, the Lord CYPHER had access to information and perspective that gave the figure behind the hood an understanding of the Rock's secrets that no one inside the chapter's institutional hierarchy possessed. Because the Lord CYPHER was there. The Lord CYPHER saw what actually happened. The Lord CYPHER knows which version of the Caliban story is accurate, and which version is the sanitized narrative the chapter has been maintaining. During CYPHER's voluntary surrender to the Dark Angels' inner circle, one of the more remarkable events in the lore, a fugitive who has been hunted for 10,000 years, walking into the heart of his hunter's territory, of his own accord. He navigated the politics of the Rock with a confidence that should not have been possible for an eagle-lever accident outsider. He knew where the Watchers were likely to be, and how to use their presence as endorsement. He knew what the inner circle needed to hear, and how to frame it so that the institutional reflexes that would otherwise produce immediate execution were at least momentarily suspended. He knew the Tukulcha engine, the ancient, semi-sentient alien artifact captured by the chapter from a previous campaign, and its capabilities, in a way that pointed toward knowledge predating the chapter's own possession of it. The Tukulcha's connection to the Caliban story is deep and complicated, running back through the planet's history into events that the chapter's official record does not fully document. CYPHER's familiarity with it suggests that the Lord CYPHER, whoever the Lord CYPHER was at the relevant times, had access to information about Caliban's history that the chapter's own records lack, which in turn suggests that the traditions the Lord CYPHER was built to preserve included things the chapter does not know it lost. When the rock story concludes, when the lion has confronted Luther, when the accounting of Caliban is finally undertaken rather than perpetually deferred, the rock's secrets will be illuminated by the testimony of the only living witnesses to what actually happened. Luther will give his account. CYPHER, if he can be heard, will give his. And L. Johnson, who was there at the beginning and who has now returned to be there at the end, will have the full picture for the first time. Section 27. The Unforgiven Chapters and Their Hidden Burden. The Dark Angel's secret does not belong to them alone. At the second founding, following the Horus Heresy, the Dark Angels were divided into successor chapters as part of the broad reorganization of the Space Marine Legions. The Unforgiven, as the Dark Angels and their successors are collectively known, share the secret of Caliban across all of their number. This creates an unusual situation. Dozens of chapters, nominally independent, nominally ignorant of each other's innermost workings, share a single guilt and a single obsessive mission. The Deathwing and the Ravenwing exist across all of them. The Inner Circle exists across all of them. The hunt for the fallen is a shared responsibility across dozens of separate institutional bodies, coordinated through channels that the wider Imperium does not know exist. The scale of resources devoted to this shared obsession is extraordinary. Entire chapters that could be deployed against the enemies threatening humanity's survival are instead repeatedly diverted to pursue a single fugitive or investigate a credible fallen sighting. The Dark Angels have drawn the attention and frustration of the wider military command structure of the Imperium repeatedly over 10,000 years because they keep abandoning campaigns mid-execution to respond to intelligence about fallen activity. The maintenance of the secret has been more costly to the Imperium's actual security than the exposure of the secret ever would have been. This institutional pathology is what the Lion's return has the potential to break. A Primarch who has acknowledged the complexity of the fallen question, who has offered pardons rather than demanded executions, who is capable of the kind of honesty about Caliban's history that no chapter officer could ever display, a Primarch in this position changes the institutional calculus completely. The secrecy was necessary when its preservation served a purpose. It becomes increasingly difficult to justify when the Primarch, whose shame was being protected, no longer needs that protection and is actively working to address the underlying issues rather than hide them. The Unforgiven chapters are in an interesting position. Their most deeply held institutional conviction, the absolute primacy of the hunt for the fallen, is being challenged by the Primarch, who is supposed to be the authority they serve. The Lion's pardons create a cognitive dissonance that the chapters are still processing. Some will adapt faster than others. Some may resist the change more stubbornly than the Lion expects. The institutional momentum of 10,000 years of absolute hunting does not simply stop because the Primarch says it should. CYPHER, moving through a galaxy where the Unforgiven chapter's approach is in the process of transforming, finds himself in an unusual position. The pursuit continues. The combined Custodes and Sisters of Silence force shows that the institutional response to his palace breach has not been tempered by the Lion's philosophical changes, but the context of the pursuit is different than it was before the Lion's return. The question of what happens if the pursuit succeeds, if CYPHER is captured and brought before the Lion rather than immediately executed, now has a different potential answer than it would have had 10 years ago. Section 28. The Mathematics of 10,000 Years. A Meditation. There is something about the specific number, 10,000 years, that the setting uses as its defining span that rewards meditation, particularly when applied to CYPHER's story. 10,000 years, measured against human experience, 100 centuries, 400 generations, 3 times the span from the earliest recorded human writing to the present day on our own world. It is a number so large that it challenges the imagination's ability to make it concrete. We can say it, we can write it, but we cannot truly feel it, the way we can feel shorter spans of time. And yet CYPHER has been maintaining a mission across this span without deviation. Without the kind of institutional support that makes sustained missions across shorter timescales possible, without successors who can pick up where he left off, without archives that maintain the purpose across personnel changes, without the redundant structures that allow institutions to outlast individuals. The mission has been maintained by one figure, or perhaps a small sequence of them passing the title, carrying the purpose personally, across a span that makes the Imperium's own institutional history look brief. Comparisons help make the number feel more real. The Adeptus Custodes have been guarding the Emperor for 10,000 years, but they have done so as an institution, with infrastructure, with leadership, with the resources of the Imperium at their disposal, with the explicit mandate and support of the structure they serve. What CYPHER has done is structurally more difficult. He has maintained a mission without institutional support, without acknowledged mandate, against active pursuit, in exile, across the same time span. The only figures in the setting who have been doing anything comparably sustained for comparably long are entities that have largely abandoned individual consciousness, the ancient dreadnoughts of the oldest chapters, beings who have spent most of 10,000 years in hibernation and have lost most of the personality that made them individuals. The Watchers in the Dark have been present for longer than CYPHER, but they are not human and do not operate by human psychological rules. For a being who started as a human, who had a name before the title, who had personal history and personal relationships and personal investment in outcomes, before the institutional identity consumed him, maintaining continuous, purposeful consciousness across 10,000 years is genuinely extraordinary. It implies a psychological stability that the setting's other long-lived individuals consistently fail to achieve. The fallen who survived the warp transit have, in many cases, been driven mad by the experience. The Daemon Primarchs are consumed by their relationships with their patron gods. Even the most stable and rational of the long-lived characters in the setting show the wear of extended existence in ways that compromise their original purposes. CYPHER has not shown this wear, not because he lacks the capacity to be worn down, but because the Lord CYPHER role was specifically designed to produce a consciousness that could maintain purpose under extended pressure. The surrender of personal identity was not a sacrifice, it was a protection. By becoming the principle rather than the person, the Lord CYPHER created a psychological structure that is resistant to the specific forms of decay that afflict individuals over extended time. The principle does not get bored. The principle does not accumulate resentments. The principle does not drift from its purpose under the weight of accumulated losses. The principle simply continues. This is both the Lord CYPHER's greatest strength and the thing about him that is hardest to fully empathize with. We understand individuals. We can feel the weight of individual sacrifice, individual loss, individual persistence. The Lord CYPHER's persistence is of a different kind, less personal, and therefore more stable, more reliable, more genuinely absolute, in a way that individual persistence never quite manages to be. And yet, the not yet moment suggests that whatever is behind the principle is still, in some residual way, a person. Because 2 words from the dying emperor, transmitted through a wounded custodian, were enough to stop him and turn him around. A pure principle, executing a mission without personal investment, would not have stopped. It would have pushed through. The fact that CYPHER stopped the fact that the Emperor's communication reached something in him that could receive it and respond to it with deference rather than override suggests that the principle has not entirely replaced the person, that somewhere inside the Lord CYPHER is still someone for whom the Emperor's words carry personal weight, not just institutional weight, that someone has been waiting for a long time, that someone heard not yet as a promise as much as a deferral. That someone is still waiting now, carrying a broken sword toward a destination that will eventually be reached. If you've made it to the final moments of this exploration genuinely, you are exactly the kind of viewer this channel exists for. The CYPHER story rewards exactly this kind of sustained investment, and I hope this gave you new angles on a character you may have been following for years, or introduced you to one of the most compelling mysteries in all of 40K lore. Drop your comment below right now. Where in the world are you? What time is it? What is your theory about what CYPHER actually intends to do when he finally reaches the Golden Throne, and do you think the not yet has become a yes by the time you are watching this? These are the questions I love discussing, And the comment section for this video is always one of the best conversations I have. Subscribe, hit the bell, share this with someone who loves this universe. Tell them there is a story about a hooded figure with 2 pistols and a sword he has never drawn, who has been walking toward the dying emperor for 10,000 years, waiting for 2 words to change. Tell them it is worth their time, because it is. The emperor protects. And somewhere between the stars, in the dark, the Lord CYPHER is still walking. Not yet. Section 29. The Iron Resolution. What CYPHER's story teaches us about the setting. Every great mystery in a rich fictional universe teaches something about the universe it inhabits. Sherlock Holmes's deductions teach you how Victorian London worked. Dune's prophecies teach you how power and mythology interact. CYPHER's mission teaches you something specific and important about what Warhammer 40,000 is, underneath all the darkness and the warfare and the overwhelming scale. The setting presents itself as the universe where everything has already gone wrong. Where the best humanity could produce was destroyed in a civil war 10,000 years ago, and everything since has been a slow, grinding rearguard action against forces that are winning. Where the institutions built to save humanity are the biggest threat to humanity's potential. Where the Emperor's dream became a nightmare, wearing the dream's face. This is the grimdark, the darkness so complete that even hope looks suspicious. And then there is CYPHER, walking through all of that, maintaining a mission that the institutions do not recognize and actively oppose, carrying a broken thing toward the place where it can be made whole, because the making whole matters, because the thing it serves is worth the carrying, because the 10,000 years of not yet does not change the truth of what the purpose is. The grimdark of the setting is real. The suffering is real. The waste and the stagnation and the corruption and the betrayal are all real. CYPHER's story does not deny any of that. His 10,000 years of lonely service took place inside all of that. Moving through it, surviving it, continuing through it without pretending it was other than what it was. But it also demonstrates something that the surface presentation of the grimdark sometimes obscures. The darkness does not negate the possibility of purpose. The corruption does not make faithfulness impossible. The stagnation does not make progress unachievable. The 10,000 years of institutional failure does not mean that one individual maintaining institutional principles through that same 10,000 years was wrong to do so. CYPHER represents the conviction that what is worth preserving can be preserved, not comfortably, not without cost, not without 10,000 years of exile and pursuit, and the slow erosion of everything except the mission, but preserved. The principle survives the institution. The mission continues after the mandate has expired. The sword broken, carried across an impossible span of time, aimed at the only place capable of making it whole, has not rusted to nothing. It is still there. It is still waiting. In a setting that often feels like an argument that everything decays and nothing is saved, CYPHER is the counter-argument. The single piece of evidence that meaningful persistence is possible. That patience can outlast catastrophe. That 2 words, not yet, can be received by someone who has been waiting 10,000 years and heard as a promise rather than a rebuke. This is why the story matters beyond its lore implications, beyond its mechanical impact on the setting's narrative development, beyond the practical questions of what happens to the Emperor and the Golden Throne and the Star Child. It matters because it is, at its core, a story about the possibility of keeping going, about the possibility that the most important things are the ones that cannot be put down, no matter what the weight becomes, about the possibility that 10,000 years of not yet is not failure. It is preparation. The moment is coming. The sword is waiting. The Lord CYPHER is still walking. And when the yet finally arrives, when the conditions the Emperor has been counting toward are met, when the broken thing is made whole in the only place capable of making it so, when the story that began on a world called Caliban 10,000 years ago finally reaches the point toward which every step of it has been moving, the galaxy will understand why patience, in this specific case, was the most powerful thing in the universe. Not yet, but it is coming. It has always been coming. Thank you for watching. Truly. If you made it to the end of this, you are exactly the audience this channel exists for, and conversations like the ones this video will generate in the comments are why I keep making content like this. I will be reading every reply. I want to know your theories. I want to know where you think this ends. And I want to know where in the world you are watching from, because there is something remarkable about a video about a character who has been walking toward a destination for 10,000 years, finding audiences across a planet, in 1,000 different places, at 1,000 different times. Drop a comment, subscribe if you haven't, share this if you think someone else would love it. The Emperor protects. And in the dark between the stars, moving always toward the door that is not yet open, the Lord CYPHER is still walking. Until the next one. Section 30. A final note. The galaxy watches and waits. There is a version of this story where everything fails, where the conditions never quite align, where the throne fails before the transformation completes, where CYPHER is captured one more time, and the sword is taken, and the mission ends not in resolution, but in the grinding way that so many things end in the 41st millennium, not with significance, but with attrition. This version of the story is possible. The grimdark exists to remind us that good outcomes are not guaranteed, that patience can be outlasted, that even the most faithfully maintained purposes can arrive too late. But it is not the version the current narrative is building toward. The acceleration of the past several years, the return of the lion, the Star Child's visions spreading, the not yet happening in published canon rather than background lore, the explicit confirmation in the end and the death that the child star concept is being brought into the current timeline. All of it points away from attrition and toward something else. Toward the resolution that the story has been building toward since the very first accounts of a hooded figure with a sword he never draws appeared in the setting's earliest lore. Games Workshop has demonstrated, in the current era, a genuine willingness to change the setting in ways that were previously unthinkable. Cadia fell. The galaxy split. Kalaman returned. The lion returned. The narrative that seemed frozen for decades is moving. The impossible is happening, regularly, as the creative direction of the setting commits to the story it has been building toward, and trusts the audience to follow it wherever it leads. CYPHER's story is the central thread running through all of that movement. The sword is the key. The Emperor is the lock. The not yet is the gap between the key and the lock, measured in years rather than the centuries it used to measure. The conditions are close. The board is set. The moment is approaching. When it comes, and the current trajectory of the setting strongly suggests it will come, that this is not a story that will be perpetually deferred into a permanently unresolved state. It will be one of the most significant events in the setting's history. Not because it resolves a mystery, though it does. Not because it changes the power dynamics of the galaxy, though it does. But because it is the story of the most patient loyalty in the setting finally being answered, the most faithful service finally being received, the most broken thing finally being made whole. The Lord CYPHER was built for this. He has been building toward this. The galaxy, whether it knows it or not, has been moving toward this. The sword is ready. The question is when the lock will be. Not yet, but soon. Epilogue. The prophecy revisited. Return, for a moment, to the prophecy preserved in the Dark Angel's own archives. He weaves in a way of my vision. I see one who is many. I see they who will test the unforgiven. In one hand, he carries hope, in the other, despair. I speak of CYPHER. He is coming closer all the time. One who is many, not one who has been many, though that is also true. Multiple bearers of the same title across the centuries, each one becoming the same principle. One who is many, right now. The Lord CYPHER carries within him every iteration of the Lord CYPHER that came before. Every decision made in the name of the principle. Every moment where the harder choice was made because it was the right choice rather than the easier one. Every step of 10,000 years of walking toward a destination. He is one body, one mission, one undrawn sword. But he is also all of that, the entire weight of the Lord CYPHER's existence, concentrated into the present moment. One hand carries hope. One carries despair. Both hands are full. He is coming closer all the time.